What if one of the strangest alien races ever described doesn't look human at all? In UFO lore, the avians, often called the Blue Avians, are mysterious bird-like beings allegedly connected to advanced extraterrestrial civilizations and higher consciousness. Some theories claim they have been observing humanity for thousands of years, while others describe them as powerful beings involved in humanity's future. But where did these bizarre stories come from? Are the avians based on ancient myths, modern contactee accounts, or something far more mysterious? In this video, we uncover the origins, alleged agenda, and hidden mysteries of the avians, the ancient bird-like alien race. Somewhere in the space between mythology and modern testimony sits a story that refuses to stay still. It has been described as a tall, blue-feathered being with the head of a bird of prey and the bearing of a monk. It has been called a messenger, a guardian, a fifth-density teacher. It has been dismissed as fantasy, defended as truth, and folded into a much older human habit of looking at the sky and imagining something looking back. This is the story of the Blue Avians, a name that entered public conversation only in the last decade, but one that its believers insist points to something ancient, patient, and still watching. To understand the Blue Avians, you have to start with a simple, uncomfortable fact. Almost everything known about them comes from one man. His name is Corey Goode, and in the fall of 2014, he began telling a story that would eventually reach millions of people, spread across radio interviews, conference stages, and a paid streaming series called Cosmic Disclosure. Goode claimed that starting in the late 1980s, as a teenager, he had been recruited into a secretive military and corporate program, what insiders in this community call the secret space program, and that decades later, in the early 2010s, he was contacted again, this time not by human handlers, but by non-human intelligences identifying themselves as part of an alliance of celestial spheres that had entered our solar system. Among them, he said, was a being that introduced itself with the name Raw Tier Air, a spokesperson for a race Goode began calling the Blue Avians. The description he gave was vivid and specific enough to catch on. Roughly 7 feet tall, blue iridescent feathers covering a humanoid body, a head resembling a bird of prey, sometimes compared to a falcon, sometimes to an owl, with an expression Goode described as serene, almost sorrowful. They did not speak in ordinary sound, he said, but communicated telepathically, in concepts and emotional impressions rather than words translated one-to-one. They wore no visible technology, carried no weapons, and radiated what witnesses in these accounts consistently describe as an overwhelming sense of calm. Whatever else people made of the claim, the image itself was striking, and it spread quickly through the online communities already primed for it. Audiences steeped in UFO research, ancient astronaut theory, and a growing, decade-long conversation about secret programs operating beyond public oversight. But the story Goode told did not present the Blue Avians as new arrivals. He described them as ancient, a race that had, according to his account, interacted with human civilization for thousands of years, appearing in the mythology of cultures that had long since lost any other record of the contact. This is the detail that gave the Blue Avians their traction beyond the immediate disclosure community, because it invited a comparison that people had already been primed to make. Long before 2014, researchers in the ancient astronaut tradition had been cataloging a strange, recurring motif across human cultures: the winged or bird-headed divine being appearing again and again in societies with no contact with one another, separated by oceans and millennia, and yet describing something remarkably similar. The thunderbird of North American indigenous traditions is often the first comparison drawn. Among the Ojibwe, the Lakota, the Menominee, and dozens of other nations across the continent, stories describe a colossal bird whose wing beats create thunder and whose eyes flash lightning, a being associated with the upper world, with storms, and often with protection against underworld serpents or monsters. In Hindu tradition, Garuda serves a comparable role, a divine birdman, mount of the god Vishnu, powerful enough to battle serpents and demons, revered as a guardian figure bridging heaven and earth. Ancient Egypt offers Horus, the falcon-headed god associated with kingship, the sky, and divine vision. whose eye remains one of the most recognized symbols to survive from that civilization. Even in Mesopotamian art, winged eagle-headed figures appear in temple reliefs, standing beside kings, performing what look like ritual gestures with cones and buckets, an image scholars have puzzled over for more than a century. None of this proves the Blue Avians are real. It proves something narrower and, in its own way, just as interesting, that the image of a winged, bird-headed being possessing wisdom, power, and a connection to the heavens is one of the most persistent religious and mythological motifs in the human record. Whether that persistence reflects a shared psychological archetype, independent invention, cultural diffusion along ancient trade routes, or, as ancient astronaut theorists argue, the memory of actual contact passed down and reshaped through generations of oral and artistic tradition is a question this documentary will return to in detail. For now, it is enough to notice that when Corey Goode described a race of blue, bird-headed beings claiming a long relationship with humanity, he was not inventing the shape from nothing. He was placing a modern testimony inside a very old frame. That placement was deliberate, at least according to how the claim developed. Goode and, later, David Wilcock, the researcher and author who became his most prominent collaborator and the host of Cosmic Disclosure, argued that the Blue Avians were not simply visiting Earth for the first time in the 2010s, but returning, or perhaps never fully having left, after a long period of relative silence. In their account, the beings had specifically chosen this moment to make deeper contact because of what they described as a planetary and even solar system-wide shift, one connected to a wave of spheres, massive, cloaked objects roughly the size of moons and larger, which Goode claimed had been tracked entering the solar system since around 2012, alongside a general increase in what he called cosmic energetic activity. The Blue Avians, in this telling, were representatives of a broader coalition, later named the Sphere Being Alliance, a group of non-human civilizations from what Goode described as a higher vibrational state, or density, than our own, who had taken an interest in Earth precisely because humanity was said to be approaching a critical threshold. That threshold is a recurring theme across the entire Blue Avian narrative, and it is worth naming clearly at the outset because it shapes everything that follows in later parts of this account. The beings are not described as conquerors, colonizers, or even primarily as scientific observers. They are described consistently as a benevolent, non-interventionist presence whose stated purpose is to encourage humanity toward what Goode's sources called service to others. A philosophical and spiritual orientation contrasted against what they characterized as a competing, more predatory path called service to self. This is not incidental language. It closely echoes terminology from a much earlier body of channeled material known as the Law of One, or the raw material, produced in the early 1980s and widely read within spiritually inclined UFO research circles decades before Goode's claims surfaced. The relationship between the Blue Avian story and the Law of One material is close enough and important enough that a later part of this documentary will examine it directly, including the criticism, raised almost immediately by skeptics familiar with both bodies of work, that the newer story may have drawn its philosophical architecture wholesale from the older one. For now, the point is narrower. From its first public telling, the Blue Avian narrative positioned itself not as an isolated encounter story, but as the latest chapter in something much longer. A story stretching back through ancient mythology, through decades of prior contactee and channeling traditions, and forward into an unfolding present that its proponents describe as a slow-motion disclosure, unfolding testimony by testimony, interview by interview, in real time. It is worth pausing here to be precise about terminology because the language used by this community carries specific meanings that matter for understanding everything that follows. When Good and Wilcock speak of density, they are not using the word the way a physicist would. In this framework, density refers to a level of spiritual and consciousness development, loosely mapped onto a scale running from first density, associated with basic elemental existence, up through third density, the level humanity is said to currently occupy, and onward to fourth, fifth, sixth, and higher densities associated with progressively greater unity, wisdom, and non-physical or semi-physical existence. The Blue Avians are described as fifth density beings, evolved past the need for physical bodies in the way humans understand them, yet capable of manifesting a physical or quasi-physical form when interacting with third density humanity in order to be perceptible and communicable at all. This is offered as the explanation for why they appear humanoid and avian rather than as pure light or energy. It is described less as their true form and more as a form chosen for the encounter, comprehensible to a third density human mind. Whether or not one finds that framework persuasive, it is internally consistent with the broader esoteric and channeling tradition it draws from, and understanding it is necessary before evaluating any of the specific claims that follow. The descriptions of contact events, the alleged messages delivered, the reasons given for why the Blue Avians supposedly chose this moment in human history, and the reasons given, just as often, by critics who argue the entire architecture was assembled from older, borrowed material rather than genuine first-hand experience. This documentary series will move through that material carefully and in order. It will trace the mythological record that predates the modern claim by thousands of years, because that record exists independently of Corey Goode and deserves to be understood on its own terms before being folded into his narrative. It will examine the specific prophetic traditions that later researchers connected to the Blue Avian story, most notably the Hopi Blue Star Kachina prophecy, a genuine and well-documented piece of Hopi oral tradition that predates the modern UFO era by generations, and which became, rightly or wrongly, one of the central pillars used to argue that the Blue Avians represent something ancient rather than newly invented. It will look closely at Edgar Cayce, the early 20th century American psychic whose readings, decades before Goode was born, described extraterrestrial involvement in human history in ways later researchers would try to connect to this same narrative. It will lay out, in full, the modern testimony as Goode and Wilcock presented it, including the internal details of Goode's claimed secret space program background, because the credibility of the Blue Avian story cannot be separated from the credibility of the man who introduced it. It will examine the philosophical content attributed to the Blue Avians, their stated teachings on non-interference, karma, unity consciousness, and the choice between service to self and service to others, and trace those teachings back to their likely sources. And it will give equal and serious weight to the skepticism this story has generated, including specific named critiques from researchers and former colleagues within Goode's own community, some of whom have publicly and directly disputed his claims, his timeline, and in some cases his basic honesty. That balance matters. A story this large, this detailed, and this widely circulated deserves to be examined with the same rigor a historian would bring to any contested testimony, not dismissed reflexively, and not accepted uncritically either. The Blue Avians occupy an unusual space in contemporary culture, too widely discussed to ignore, too unverified to confirm, and too tied up with genuinely ancient mythological patterns to separate cleanly from the deeper human history of imagining winged messengers between earth and sky. Untangling what is old, what is borrowed, what is testimony, and what may be invention is the task of everything that follows. Before moving into that deeper history, it is worth sitting for a moment with why this story found an audience at all. Corey Goode was not the first person to claim contact with a benevolent alien race. He was not even the first to claim contact with a bird-like one. The contactee movement of the 1950s produced dozens of similar figures, some of whom will appear later in this documentary, each describing tall, human-like beings from Venus or the Pleiades, bearing warnings and reassurances about humanity's future. What made the Blue Avian story land differently, at least for a significant portion of its audience, was timing. It arrived at a moment when interest in secret government programs, whistleblower testimony, and ancient astronaut theory had already been building for years, amplified by cable television documentaries, expanding internet forums, and a cultural mood increasingly comfortable entertaining the idea that official history was incomplete. Into that environment, Good's account offered something specific, not a vague promise of contact to come, but a detailed, ongoing relationship, complete with a named spokesperson, a described physical form, a stated philosophy, and a claimed connection to prophetic traditions that predated modern UFO culture by centuries. It offered, in other words, a complete mythology, arriving fully formed at exactly the moment a receptive audience was primed to hear it. Whether that mythology reflects genuine contact with an ancient extraterrestrial race, a sincerely held but mistaken experience, a knowing fabrication, or some combination of all three, is a question this documentary does not need to resolve in its opening minutes. What it can do, and what the parts that follow will do, is lay out everything that is actually known: the mythological record, the claimed testimony, the philosophical content, the corroborating and contradicting voices, clearly enough that the audience can weigh it for themselves. That process begins, in the next part, with the oldest evidence available: the bird-headed gods and thunder beings that appear across human civilization long before anyone had heard the words Blue Avian at all. The mythological record, bird-headed gods across civilizations. Long before anyone spoke of Blue Avians, human beings across the world were already telling stories about winged beings who bridged the gap between earth and sky. These stories did not emerge from a single source and spread outward. They arose, largely independently, in societies separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years, and yet they share a family resemblance too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Understanding that mythological record on its own terms, before folding it into any modern claim, is essential to evaluating what researchers in the ancient astronaut and disclosure communities later did with it. Across the North American continent, the thunderbird stands as one of the most widespread and well-documented of these figures. Among the Ojibwe, it is described as a massive bird whose wings, when beaten, produce the sound of thunder and whose eyes flash lightning across the sky. It is associated with the upper world, a realm of order and sky power, often locked in a cosmic tension with underwater serpents or horned water panthers that represent the forces of chaos and the deep. Among the Lakota and other Plains nations, the thunderbird, Wakanyan, occupies a similarly central place in cosmology, appearing in ceremony, in the Sundance tradition, and in accounts of storms as a living, willful presence rather than a mere symbol for weather. The Kwakwaka'wakw and other Pacific Northwest nations carved and painted thunderbird imagery onto totem poles and ceremonial regalia, depicting a being powerful enough to hunt whales, its wings vast enough to darken the sky. What is notable, from a comparative standpoint, is not simply that a thunderbird exists in North American tradition, but that variations of it appear independently across dozens of distinct nations, language families, and regions stretching from the Pacific coast to the Great Lakes to the southeast. A spread that predates any shared contact with European colonizers, and that speaks to either a very old, deeply diffused cultural memory or a recurring symbolic response to the genuine, universal experience of thunderstorms interpreted through the lens of a winged, animate sky. Move across the Pacific and into the religious traditions of South Asia, and a structurally similar figure appears in a completely different cultural context. Garuda, in Hindu and later Buddhist tradition, is described as a divine being, part man and part eagle, powerful enough to block out the sun with his wingspan and to do battle with the Naga, serpent deities associated with water and the underworld. Garuda serves as the mount of Vishnu, one of the principal gods of the Hindu pantheon, pantheon and appears throughout Sanskrit epic literature, including the Mahabharata, where his birth and early exploits are described in extensive detail. A being born already blazing with divine fire, forcing the other gods to shield their eyes. The Garuda motif spread with Hindu and Buddhist religious influence throughout Southeast Asia, appearing today as a national symbol in Indonesia, Thailand, and Mongolia, among others, and remains one of the most recognized bird-human deity figures still actively venerated in the world. Ancient Egypt offers perhaps the most visually iconic version of this pattern in Horus, the falcon-headed god associated with the sky, with kingship, and with divine sight. Egyptian mythology describes Horus's eyes as the sun and the moon, and the symbol of the Eye of Horus, stylized, geometric, unmistakable, survives today as one of the most reproduced images from that entire civilization, appearing on amulets, in modern jewelry, and across popular culture with little regard for its original theological weight. Horus was not a minor figure in the Egyptian pantheon. He was directly tied to the legitimacy of the pharaoh, who was understood to be Horus's living embodiment on earth, making the falcon-headed god a figure of active political and religious authority for thousands of years, not simply a distant mythic character. Alongside Horus, Egyptian religion included other avian or partially avian deities, including Thoth, sometimes depicted with the head of an ibis, associated with writing, knowledge, and the judgment of the dead, reinforcing a broader Egyptian association between bird-headed forms and divine wisdom, sight, and authority over transitions between worlds. Mesopotamian art contributes a different and in some ways stranger piece to this record. Temple reliefs from Assyrian palaces, particularly from the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, depict winged, eagle-headed figures, often identified by scholars as Apkallu, a class of semi-divine sages from Mesopotamian mythology, credited with bringing civilization, knowledge, and craft to early humanity before a great flood. These figures are frequently shown standing beside a stylized tree, performing what appears to be a ritual gesture, holding a cone-shaped object in one hand and a bucket-like vessel in the other. The purpose of this gesture has been debated by Assyriologists for well over a century, with interpretations ranging from ritual purification and pollination symbolism to more fanciful modern readings that have at times been misappropriated by ancient astronaut theorists as evidence of advanced technology being depicted in ancient stone. It is worth being precise here. Mainstream Assyriology does not interpret these carvings as depictions of extraterrestrial visitors, and the Apkallu figures fit coherently within a documented, internally consistent Mesopotamian mythological framework concerning divine sages, sacred trees, and ritual fertility. Their relevance to this documentary is not as proof of anything, but as one more data point in an already large pattern, a winged, bird-headed being associated with the transmission of knowledge and standing between the human and the divine, appearing yet again in a civilization with no known contact with Egypt, India, or the nations of North America. Jewish folklore contributes the ziz, a massive bird described in later rabbinic and midrashic literature as one of three primordial giant creatures, alongside the Leviathan of the sea and the behemoth of the land, created to maintain balance in the natural world. The ziz is described as large enough to block out the sun with its wingspan and is associated, in some traditions, with protecting smaller birds and creatures from storms and disaster. Unlike Horus or Garuda, the ziz did not become a central object of worship, but its inclusion in the same broad category of colossal, storm-associated protective bird figures reinforces the same pattern. Across cultures with no direct connection to one another, the image of an immense, sky-dwelling avian being recurs as a symbol of both danger and protection. Mesoamerican tradition offers a related, though distinct, thread through the feathered serpent, rather than a purely avian form. Quetzalcoatl, venerated across multiple Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Aztec, and, in a related form as Kukulkan, the Maya, combines serpent and bird, specifically the brilliant plumage of the Quetzal bird, into a single deity associated with wind, learning, the priesthood, and the movement between earth and sky. While Quetzalcoatl is not identical to the bird-headed humanoid figures described elsewhere, the deliberate combination of feathered flight with serpentine, earthbound power echoes the same underlying symbolic logic found in the Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions. A being that unites the realm of the sky with the realm of the earth, embodying both at once and standing as an intermediary between ordinary human life and forces beyond it. Ancient Egypt supplies one further figure worth naming directly because of how often it is invoked in modern discussions, connecting mythology to extraterrestrial contact. The Bennu bird, a heron-like deity associated with the sun, with creation, and with rebirth, often considered a precursor influence on the later Greek myth of the phoenix. The Bennu was described as self-created, appearing at the dawn of time on the primordial mound that rose from the waters of chaos, and its cyclical association with death and renewal gave it enormous symbolic weight within Egyptian solar theology. The phoenix myth that descended from it, adopted and adapted by Greek and later Roman writers, would go on to become one of the most durable mythological images in Western culture, still instantly recognizable today, thousands of years after its Egyptian origin. Taken together, these traditions form a pattern that is genuinely striking, regardless of how one chooses to interpret it. A winged or bird-headed being, frequently oversized, frequently associated with thunder, storms, or the sun, frequently positioned as a guardian, teacher, or bridge between the human and the divine, appears independently in North America, South Asia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Mesoamerica. Civilizations that, as far as conventional archaeology and history can establish, had no direct contact with one another during the periods when these traditions were forming. There are three broad explanations offered for this pattern, and a serious documentary owes its audience all three, rather than favoring the most dramatic one by default. The first explanation, favored by most mainstream anthropologists and comparative mythologists, treats this pattern as an example of independent cultural convergence. The idea that human beings, observing the same natural phenomena and confronting the same universal psychological questions, tend to arrive at similar symbolic solutions even without contact. Thunder is loud, sudden, and terrifying. Birds are the most visible creatures capable of flight. It is not difficult to imagine multiple unconnected human societies independently landing on the image of a colossal bird as an explanation for storms, or on a bird-headed figure as a symbol of vision, wisdom, and the ability to move freely between the grounded human world and the distant, unreachable sky. This explanation does not require any contact, ancient or otherwise, between these cultures, and it is consistent with a large and independently documented body of research into recurring mythological archetypes across unconnected societies. The second explanation involves cultural diffusion through trade, migration, and contact that occurred earlier or more extensively than is commonly assumed. A position taken seriously by some historians and archaeologists in specific, well-evidenced cases, though it remains far more contested and far less broadly supported when used to explain the full global spread of bird deity imagery. Ancient trade networks did connect regions once thought to be isolated from one another, and myths, along with goods and technologies, have demonstrably traveled along such routes in documented cases elsewhere in history. Whether this fully accounts for the bird-headed deity pattern across continents as distant as North America and India remains a minority position within mainstream scholarship, and it is a claim that would require far more specific archaeological and linguistic evidence than currently exists to be broadly accepted. The third explanation is the one favored by ancient astronaut theorists and later, directly, by proponents of the Blue Avian narrative, that these myths preserve a genuine folk memory of actual encounters with a real, physically present, winged non-human intelligence, reshaped over generations of oral transmission into the language of gods, spirits, and monsters available to each culture at the time. In this reading, Horus, Garuda, the Thunderbird, and the Mesopotamian Apkallu are not independently invented symbols responding to storms and sunlight, but distorted historical records of the same underlying phenomenon witnessed by different human populations at different points in deep history, each describing what they saw using the religious vocabulary available to them. This documentary is not in a position to adjudicate definitively between these three explanations, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What can be said with confidence is that the mythological record itself is real, well-documented, and older by thousands of years than any modern testimony about Blue Avians. What can also be said is that when Corey Goode's account surfaced in 2014, it did not arrive into a cultural vacuum. It arrived into a research tradition, ancient astronaut theory, that had already spent decades cataloging exactly this pattern of bird-headed, winged, sky-associated deities, and treating that pattern as suggestive evidence for prior contact. Whether the modern claim genuinely connects to that ancient record, or whether it borrows the record's symbolic weight to lend credibility to a much more recent and much less independently verifiable testimony, is a question that becomes sharper, not softer, the more closely the mythology is examined. One tradition in particular sits closer to the modern Blue Avian claim than any of the ones covered so far, both in geography and in the directness with which later researchers connected it to Corey Goode's testimony. It comes not from ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, but from a still living, still practiced indigenous prophetic tradition in the American Southwest, the Hopi Blue Star Kachina prophecy. That prophecy, its documented history, and the specific, contested way it became entangled with the modern Blue Avian narrative is the subject of the next part. The Hopi Blue Star prophecy and its modern reinterpretation. Among all the pieces of older tradition that later became attached to the Blue Avian story, none is invoked more often or more confidently than the Hopi prophecy of the Blue Star Kachina. It is worth stating plainly at the outset what this documentary is working with and what it is not. The Hopi prophetic tradition is real, it is documented, and it has been shared publicly, in the Hopi's own words, by recognized traditional spokespeople. What is far less settled and considerably more contested is the specific interpretation that later non-Hopi researchers, including those associated with the Blue Avian narrative, layered on top of it. The Hopi people of northeastern Arizona maintain one of the most intact and continuously practiced ceremonial and prophetic traditions among indigenous nations in North America. Central to Hopi religious life is the Kachina, a spirit being representing an aspect of the natural or supernatural world, honored through elaborate ceremonial dances performed by members of the community, often wearing carved masks and regalia representing the specific Kachina being invoked. There are hundreds of recognized Kachinas in Hopi tradition, each associated with different roles, seasons, and aspects of life. Alongside this ceremonial practice, Hopi elders have long maintained a body of prophecy concerning the future of their people and, in the broadest tellings, the future of the world. Prophecy understood not as vague mysticism, but as a specific, transmitted responsibility carried by designated traditional leaders and shared at what they judged to be the appropriate moment. That moment, for public English language dissemination of these prophecies, is generally traced to the work of Thomas Banyachia, a Hopi elder and interpreter who was designated by a council of traditional Hopi leaders in 1948 to serve as a messenger, tasked with communicating Hopi prophecy to the wider world, including to the United Nations, which he addressed directly in 1992. Banyachia's role emerged from a broader context, a 1948 gathering of traditional Hopi religious leaders who determined that the time had come to begin sharing certain prophecies outside the community, given what they saw as mounting signs that events long foretold were beginning to unfold. Banyachia spent decades afterward traveling, speaking, and writing, presenting Hopi prophecy in interviews, at conferences, and eventually in formal international settings, always framing it as a warning tied to the moral and spiritual condition of the world, and always insisting that it be understood within the context of Hopi religious life, rather than extracted as an isolated curiosity. Among the prophecies Banyasya and other Hopi spokespeople shared publicly was what has become known in wider circulation as the Blue Star Kachina prophecy, a reference to Sakwasohu, one of the Kachinas in Hopi tradition, whose ceremonial dance, according to the prophecy, would not be performed again until a specific and significant point in the unfolding of events described by Hopi elders as the Day of Purification, a time of major upheaval and transformation understood in Hopi tradition as both a culmination of and a corrective to a long period of imbalance and moral decline. The prophecy holds that when the Sakwasahu Kachina dances in the plaza and then removes its mask in front of uninitiated observers, an act that would violate the deepest protocols of Hopi ceremonial practice, since Kachina masks are traditionally never removed in public in this way, it will signal that the fourth world in Hopi cosmology is ending and a fifth world is beginning. Some versions of the prophecy, as communicated in Banyasya's public statements and in interviews with other Hopi elders over the decades, associate this transition with the appearance of what is described as a blue star, still distant, not yet visible, whose eventual appearance in the sky would mark this final stage. It is at exactly this point, the mention of a blue star tied to a major planetary transition, that the prophecy was picked up decades later by researchers entirely outside the Hopi community and reinterpreted through the lens of extraterrestrial contact, in the framework built by ancient astronaut theorists and later adopted directly by Corey Goode and David Wilcock. The blue star of Hopi prophecy became read as a literal astronomical or extraterrestrial signal, sometimes associated with a comet, sometimes with a brown dwarf star theorized by fringe astronomy circles, and specifically within the Blue Avian narrative connected directly to the arrival and increasing visibility of the beings Goode described. In Wilcock's public commentary and writing, the Hopi Blue Star prophecy is presented as independent, ancient corroboration of the modern testimony, evidence that indigenous prophetic tradition had, centuries in advance, anticipated the same event Goode claimed to be personally witnessing in the present day. This is where a serious documentary has an obligation to slow down and be precise, because the gap between what Hopi spokespeople have actually said and what outside researchers have done with it is significant, and it has been a source of real frustration and pushback within Hopi communities themselves. Thomas Banyasya's own presentations of Hopi prophecy across decades of public record framed the material within Hopi cosmology, Hopi ethics, and a Hopi understanding of purification tied to human behavior, environmental balance, and spiritual conduct, not as an advanced description of a specific extraterrestrial race arriving to guide humanity through an ascension event. Hopi scholars, cultural preservation advocates, and tribal members have on multiple occasions publicly objected to the way New Age and UFO research communities have extracted fragments of Hopi prophecy, stripped them of their original ceremonial and cultural context, and reassembled them inside frameworks, channeled alien contact, 2012 related cosmic shift theories, secret space program testimony, that have nothing to do with how the Hopi themselves have described their own tradition. This pattern of appropriation predates the Blue Avian story by decades. The same prophecy was already being folded into 2012 apocalypse discourse and various New Age cosmic shift narratives well before Corey Goode's account surfaced, and Hopi cultural advocates were already pushing back on that appropriation before the Blue Avians were ever mentioned by name. None of this means the underlying Hopi prophecy itself is not genuine, or that it holds no significance. It plainly does, to the community that has carried and protected it for generations, and it deserves to be represented with that seriousness rather than dismissed. What it means, specifically, is that the frequently repeated claim within Blue Avian discourse that Hopi elders foretold the arrival of a specific extraterrestrial race matching Goode's description does not hold up against the actual public record of what Hopi spokespeople have said in their own words. The blue star imagery exists in Hopi prophecy. Its explicit, literal connection to a race of blue, bird-headed extraterrestrial beings does not exist in that record. That connection was added later by outside interpreters and then cited back as though it were independent ancient confirmation of the modern claim, when in fact the causal direction runs the other way. Modern researchers read a pre-existing outside interest in extraterrestrial contact into a prophecy that was not originally about that at all. There is a further layer of irony worth noting here because it recurs throughout the broader history of ancient astronaut theory and will come up again in later parts of this documentary dealing with Edgar Cayce and with the Law of One material. Once a piece of genuine older tradition gets cited as corroboration for a newer claim, it tends to get treated in subsequent retellings as though the corroboration were established fact, rather than as a contested interpretive leap made by a specific person at a specific point in time. Repetition, in other words, does a great deal of the work that evidence would otherwise need to do. By the time the Blue Avian narrative had circulated for a few years across podcasts, YouTube channels, and Wilcox's own writing, the claim that the Hopi predicted the Blue Avians had, for a significant portion of the audience, hardened from a contested reinterpretation into an accepted talking point. One more brick in a wall of apparent corroboration that, on closer inspection, is considerably less solid than its cumulative weight suggests. This does not settle the deeper question of whether Hopi prophecy or any other ancient prophetic or mythological tradition might reflect a genuine memory of non-human contact passed down and reshaped over generations, a possibility this documentary is not in a position to rule out, and one that ancient astronaut researchers, whatever the flaws in their specific handling of individual sources, have raised in ways that at least merit consideration rather than automatic dismissal. What can be said clearly is that the specific evidentiary chain often presented to the public, Hopi elders foretold a blue star, therefore Hopi elders foretold the Blue Avians, therefore the Blue Avians are confirmed by ancient indigenous prophecy, does not survive contact with the actual documented statements of the Hopi people who carried that prophecy, and it should not be repeated as though it does. A second related tradition gets invoked in exactly this same pattern of after-the-fact corroboration, though it comes from a very different source. Not an indigenous oral tradition carried by designated spokespeople over centuries, but the trance readings of a single American man delivered in the first half of the 20th century, decades before flying saucers entered public consciousness at all. That man was Edgar Cayce, and his readings, genuinely documented, genuinely predating the modern UFO era, and genuinely strange in their own right, form the next thread in this story and the subject of the part that follows. Edgar Cayce and the birth of the Law of One. If the Hopi prophecy represents a genuine older tradition stretched to fit a modern claim, Edgar Cayce represents something different. A documented body of material predating the flying saucer era by decades that later researchers would treat not just as loosely corroborating the Blue Avian story, but as its direct spiritual and terminological ancestor. To understand why the phrase Law of One, a phrase that becomes central to everything the Blue Avians are later said to teach, appears throughout this narrative at all, you have to go back to a man who died in 1945, nearly 70 years before Corey Goode said a word in public. Edgar Cayce was born in Kentucky in 1877 and became known, over the course of his life, as the Sleeping Prophet, a nickname earned through a practice he began in his 20s and continued for decades, in which he would enter a self-induced trance state and deliver what he described as psychic readings, typically addressing a specific person's physical health, though later expanding into far broader territory. Cayce's readings were transcribed by stenographers present at the sessions, and over roughly 40 years of practice, more than 14,000 of these transcripts were preserved, forming an unusually large and systematically documented body of psychic material, a scale that sets Cayce apart from most other claimed psychics of his era, whose work survives, if at all, in far more fragmentary form. This archive is maintained today by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, an organization Cayce founded, headquartered in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which continues to catalog, publish, and study the readings. The early Cayce readings focused overwhelmingly on health, diagnosing illness, recommending treatments, often for people Cayce had never met, and in some cases had never even been told the name of, relying instead on identifying details supplied to him while in trance. As his reputation grew, the scope of the readings expanded. Casey began delivering what came to be called life readings, addressing not physical ailments, but the deeper spiritual history of the individual requesting them, frequently describing what he characterized as past lives, incarnations in ancient Egypt, in Rome, in Atlantis, framed within a broader cosmology of reincarnation and soul development that Casey presented as consistent, recurring, and internally coherent across thousands of separate sessions with different individuals. It is within these life readings, and particularly within the readings touching on Atlantis, that the material most relevant to this documentary appears. Casey described Atlantis not as a single myth borrowed from Plato, but as a genuine, technologically advanced ancient civilization destroyed, according to his readings, through the catastrophic misuse of crystal-based energy technology by a faction Casey called the Sons of Belial, a group he contrasted against another faction he named the Children of the Law of One, described as spiritually oriented, committed to harmony, and opposed to the destructive application of Atlantean technology that the Sons of Belial pursued. This is the first documented appearance of the specific phrase, Law of One, in this entire lineage of material, appearing in Casey's trance readings roughly half a century before it resurfaces, transformed but recognizably related, in the philosophical vocabulary attributed decades later to the Blue Avians. Casey's readings did not stop at Atlantis. A number of them addressed the origin of the human soul in terms that later researchers would read as an early, if oblique, extraterrestrial framework. Certain readings describe souls as having origins or formative experiences associated with other planets within the solar system, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, described not necessarily as literal, physically inhabited worlds in the way a modern astronomer would use the term, but as distinct planes or vibrational stages of soul development that a given individual's spiritual history had passed through prior to incarnating on Earth. Casey also gave readings addressing what he called Earth changes, predictions of significant future geological upheaval, shifting coastlines, and large-scale planetary transformation, framed as consequences of humanity's collective spiritual and moral trajectory rather than as arbitrary catastrophe. This combination, ancient advanced civilizations destroyed by their own technological and moral failures, souls with origins tied to other worlds, and a coming period of planetary transformation tied to human conduct, maps with striking closeness onto the general shape of the narrative that Good and Wilcock would present decades later as the context surrounding the Blue Avians' arrival. The bridge between Casey's readings and the modern Blue Avian narrative runs through one specific person more than any other, David Wilcock. Before his collaboration with Corey Goode and before Cosmic Disclosure existed as a television series, Wilcock had already built a public career, beginning in the 1990s and expanding through the 2000s with his website and later his book, The Source Field Investigations, around the argument that ancient wisdom traditions, modern scientific anomalies, and psychic and channeled material all pointed toward a coherent, hidden picture of human history and cosmic development. Central to Wilcock's public persona from very early in his career was a specific and striking personal claim: that he was, in some meaningful sense, a continuation or reincarnation of Edgar Casey himself, a claim Wilcock based on what he described as detailed physical, astrological, and biographical parallels between his own life and Casey's, along with subjective psychic impressions he said he had received independently confirming the connection. This claim matters for understanding the entire architecture of the Blue Avian story, because it means the person who would go on to interview Corey Goode on camera, host Cosmic Disclosure, and present the Blue Avian narrative to its widest audience did not arrive as a neutral investigator encountering a new and unfamiliar claim. He arrived already publicly positioned as Casey's spiritual successor, already fluent in Casey's specific terminology, including the phrase Law of One, and already committed years in advance to a broader worldview in which ancient civilizations, hidden history, and cosmic spiritual evolution were understood to be real and interconnected. When Goode's account of the Blue Avians surfaced, describing beings who taught a philosophy built around exactly the phrase Casey had introduced decades earlier, the Law of One, service to others versus service to self, densities of spiritual development, it did not require Wilcock to make an unfamiliar interpretive leap. It slotted directly into a framework he had already spent close to 2 decades building and publicly advocating, with Casey as its acknowledged founding source. This is worth sitting with carefully because it cuts in 2 directions at once, and a fair documentary needs to present both. For believers in the Blue Avian narrative, this continuity is treated as evidence of authenticity. The idea that Casey, decades before the modern UFO era, was tapping into the same real cosmic truth that Good would later encounter directly, with Wilcox serving as a kind of bridge figure uniquely positioned, given his own claimed history, to recognize and validate the connection when it appeared. For critics, the same continuity is treated as evidence of the opposite, that the Blue Avian philosophy was not received from an independent, non-human source at all, but was assembled, consciously or unconsciously, from material Wilcox already knew intimately. Casey's readings, and as the next part of this documentary will show in detail, the later Law of One material channeled in the early 1980s, which Wilcox had also studied extensively and written about long before he ever met Corey Goode. There is a further point worth making plainly, because it is easy to lose amid the more dramatic elements of this story. Casey's readings, whatever one makes of their broader validity, do not describe blue, bird-headed beings. There is no reading among the more than 14,000 preserved in the Association for Research and Enlightenment's archive that mentions an avian extraterrestrial race, a figure resembling raw-tier air or a sphere-being alliance entering the solar system. What Casey's readings do provide is the deep philosophical and terminological substrate, the Law of One as a named concept, the idea of soul origins tied to other worlds, the framework of coming planetary Earth changes tied to human spiritual conduct, onto which the specific imagery of the Blue Avians was later grafted, decades afterward, by people who had inherited and were actively working within Casey's conceptual vocabulary. Understanding this distinction is essential to everything that follows. The Blue Avian narrative did not emerge from nothing, and it did not emerge as a single, self-contained testimony, independent of prior tradition. It emerged at the convergence point of several older threads. Ancient bird deity mythology spanning multiple civilizations, a reinterpreted fragment of Hopi prophecy, and a decades-old body of psychic material from Edgar Cayce that had already introduced the specific philosophical language later attributed directly to the beings themselves. Each of these threads, examined individually, is either a well-documented but unrelated mythological pattern, a contested reinterpretation of indigenous tradition, or a body of psychic material with no direct mention of avian beings at all. Woven together by researchers already committed to finding the connections, they produce something that reads, to a receptive audience, as a deep and ancient corroborating record. Examined thread by thread, the picture that emerges is considerably more assembled than discovered. One thread remains before the modern testimony itself can be addressed directly, and it is, in many ways, the most important one, because it supplies not just a phrase, but an entire detailed philosophical and cosmological system that the Blue Avians would later be said to teach almost verbatim. That thread begins in 1981 in a series of channeling sessions conducted by a small research group in Kentucky, producing a body of material that would come to be known as the Law of One, or the raw material. And it is to that material, and its startlingly close relationship to everything Good would later claim the Blue Avians told him, that this documentary turns next. The Law of One, raw, densities, and the language the Blue Avians would later borrow. In January of 1981, in a small research group operating out of Louisville, Kentucky, a series of channeling sessions began that would go on to shape the vocabulary of American UFO spirituality for the next 4 decades. Whether or not most of the people later using that vocabulary knew where it came from, the group was led by Don Elkins, a physics professor at the University of Louisville with a long-standing personal interest in psychic phenomena, UFO research, and the work of Edgar Cayce. Working alongside him were Carla Ruckert, who served as the trance channel for the sessions, and Jim McCarty, who recorded and later helped compile the material. Together, they operated under the name LL Research, and beginning that January, over the course of roughly 3 years and 106 recorded sessions, they produced a body of material channeled from an entity identifying itself as Ra. material that was eventually published as a 5-volume work titled The Law of One. The entity calling itself Ra described itself across these sessions as a 6th-density social memory complex, a term used within the material to describe a collective consciousness formed from many individual entities who had progressed together to a point where their awareness had merged into a unified whole, no longer experiencing themselves as fully separate individuals in the way 3rd-density humans do. Ra stated that it had, in a much earlier phase of its own development, been physically present on Earth, associated specifically with ancient Egypt and with the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza, before withdrawing from direct physical interaction with humanity after concluding that its presence, intended to help, had instead been misapplied and misunderstood by the Egyptian priesthood of the time, leading to what Ra described as harmful, hierarchical distortions of its original teaching. Ra described itself as a member of a larger group it called the Confederation of Planets in the service of the infinite creator, often shortened in later discussion to simply the Confederation, a loose alliance, according to the material, of numerous non-physical and physical civilizations throughout the galaxy, united by a shared commitment to what the material called service to others, offered to any world, including Earth, that requested help, but never imposed without invitation. It is at this point that the terminology becomes impossible to separate from what Corey Goode would later attribute directly to the Blue Avians, more than 3 decades afterward. The Ra material lays out, in extensive and internally systematic detail, a framework of densities, numbered stages of consciousness and spiritual development, running from 1st density, associated with the most basic elemental awareness of earth, air, fire, and water, through 2nd density, associated with growth and the beginnings of individuated life, to 3rd density, the stage the material identifies as humanity's current condition, defined by free will and the deliberate choice between 2 fundamental spiritual orientations. Those 2 orientations are named directly in the material as service to others and service to self. Polarities the Ra material treats as the defining axis of spiritual evolution, with progression to 4th density and beyond understood as contingent on an entity or a planet's population as a whole, sufficiently polarizing toward one path or the other by the end of a roughly 75,000-year 3rd density cycle, a transition point the material refers to as harvest. Every one of these terms, density, service to others, service to self, harvest, confederation, appears in Corey Goode's account of what the Blue Avians told him, presented not as concepts he had studied beforehand, but as teachings delivered directly, telepathically, by Ra Tier Air and other members of the Sphere Being Alliance during his claimed encounters beginning in the early 2010s. The Ra material additionally introduces a concept called the Wanderer, a soul from a higher density who voluntarily incarnates into a lower density, 3rd density body on a world like Earth, taking on the accompanying forgetfulness and struggle of that incarnation in order to be of service, to help raise the consciousness of the population from within, often at considerable personal cost, since the Wanderer typically retains no explicit memory of their higher density origin while incarnated. This concept, too, appears directly within the broader cosmic disclosure narrative, both in claims made about certain individuals within the secret space program community and in the general framing Wilcock and Goode gave to their own roles within the unfolding story. The Ra material also describes an opposing group, generally referred to across the sessions and in later summary as the Orion Group or Orion Empire, a coalition of civilizations oriented towards service to self, exerting negative, controlling, manipulative influence on less advanced worlds, including Earth, in competition with the Confederation's more restrained, invitation-only approach. This, too, maps closely onto later secret space program discourse, in which negative, controlling extraterrestrial factions, described using a range of names across different testimonies within the broader community, though consistently structured around this same service-to-self, manipulative influence framework, are presented as a rival force to the more benevolent alliance the Blue Avians are said to represent. None of this overlap is coincidental, and it is not treated as coincidental by critics of the Blue Avian narrative, many of whom point to this specific body of material as the most direct and traceable source of the philosophical architecture Good later attributed to direct alien contact. The connection runs, once again, through David Wilcock. Wilcock's public writing and lectures throughout the 1990s and 2000s, well before cosmic disclosure existed, engaged extensively and repeatedly with the raw material, treating it as one of the central sources underpinning his broader synthesis of ancient wisdom, esoteric science, and cosmic history. By the time Wilcock met and began collaborating with Good, he had spent close to 2 decades publicly working with, teaching, and quoting the Law of One material, making him, among the people involved in popularizing the Blue Avian story, the single individual with the deepest prior fluency in exactly the vocabulary that would go on to define what the Blue Avians were said to teach. Corey Goode, for his part, has stated in interviews that he was not deeply familiar with the raw material before his claimed contact experiences began, and has framed the overlap in terminology as evidence that his independent, direct contact was accessing the same genuine cosmic truth that Ra had already communicated to the Elkins group decades earlier. 2 separate, unconnected channels arriving at the same underlying reality, which believers within this framework argue should be read as corroboration rather than derivation. This is a claim this documentary cannot independently verify or disprove. There is no way to conclusively establish what Good did or did not know or read or absorb secondhand through years spent within UFO research and contactee communities where raw material terminology was already in wide circulation, well before he came forward publicly in 2014. What can be said with confidence, because it rests on documented, dated, published material rather than on personal testimony, is the timeline itself. The Law of One sessions were recorded and later published in the early to mid-1980s, more than 3 decades before Good's public account began. Wilcock's own writing and lectures drawing extensively on that material are similarly dated and publicly available, stretching back to well before his collaboration with Good began around 2014 and 2015. The specific vocabulary, density, harvest, service to self, service to others, confederation, wanderer, did not originate with the Blue Avians. It originated, at the very least in its fully developed and systematized form, with Ra, channeled through Carla Rueckert, itself explicitly built in conscious continuity with Casey's earlier introduction of the phrase Law of One and his description of the children of the Law of One as an Atlantean faction. When the Blue Avians are described as teaching the same system, in close to the same language, the honest and necessary question is not whether the system itself has any validity. That remains, as with everything in this documentary, a matter of personal judgment rather than settled fact. But whether the Blue Avian testimony represents an independent confirmation of that system, or a retelling of it, consciously or unconsciously assembled from material already deeply familiar to at least one of the 2 men who brought the story to the public. It is worth noting, in fairness to the raw material itself, that Carla Rueckert and her collaborators at LL Research maintained, across their decades of work, a notably different tone and set of claims than what later developed within the secret space program and Blue Avian community. The original Law of One sessions were explicitly framed as spiritual philosophy and cosmology offered for consideration, not as testimony about physical spacecraft, secret military programs, or literal, currently ongoing contact with visible non-human beings walking among specific individuals. Rueckert and her collaborators were, at various points over the following decades, notably reserved about, and in some cases directly distanced themselves from, the way their material was later absorbed, expanded, and physicalized by a newer generation of researchers and public figures within the broader disclosure movement. A tension that has been discussed openly within the LL research community and among longtime students of the original material, some of whom view the newer, more elaborate, secret space program mythology as a significant and not entirely faithful departure from the far more contemplative, non-physical spiritual philosophy Ra originally presented. That distinction matters for understanding the full shape of this story. the law of one material, whatever one makes of its ultimate source or validity, exists as a self-contained, internally consistent body of channeled philosophy, produced by a specific, named, historically documented group, and it has its own independent audience and legacy, entirely separate from Corey Goode. The Blue Avian narrative did not simply continue that legacy in a straightforward way. It took its vocabulary and its cosmological framework and embedded them inside a much more elaborate, much more physically concrete story, one involving actual spacecraft, actual military and corporate installations, actual visible beings appearing before witnesses, and an actual chronological narrative of secret government activity stretching back decades. That shift from contemplative channeled philosophy to a detailed operational testimony about secret programs and physical extraterrestrial visitors is itself one of the more significant and consequential transformations in this entire lineage. And it is exactly the shift that occurred when Corey Goode's testimony entered the picture and found, in David Wilcock, a collaborator uniquely equipped to recognize its vocabulary and give it a platform. That collaboration and the testimony it was built around is where this documentary turns next. The specific claims Corey Goode has made about his own background, the origins of the term secret space program within this community, and the detailed account of how, in his telling, first contact with the Blue Avians actually occurred. Corey Goode and the Secret Space Program testimony. To evaluate the Blue Avian story, it is necessary to understand the man who introduced it, because unlike the raw material or the Hopi prophecy, there is no independent, third-party historical record to examine here. There is only Corey Goode's own account of his life, delivered across years of interviews, written statements, and on-camera testimony, and it is that account, more than any other single source, that the entire modern Blue Avian narrative rests on. According to Goode's own telling, his involvement with secret programs began not in adulthood, but in early childhood in the mid-1970s, growing up in Texas. He has stated that he was identified as a child with unusual psychic aptitude and drawn, around the age of 6, into a training program he has referred to in various interviews as part of a broader project connected to intelligence and military psychological research, describing early experiences that he has characterized in later retellings using language associated with monarch-style trauma-based programming claims. A category of allegation with a long and separately controversial history within conspiracy research communities, generally treated by mainstream researchers as unsubstantiated. Goode has said that this early phase served as a preparation period, eventually leading, in his account, to formal induction at around age 16 into a more advanced initiative he has named Solar Warden, described within his testimony and within the broader secret space program community as a covert, off-world military space fleet operated by a coalition of nations and private aerospace contractors existing entirely outside public knowledge and separate from NASA's civilian space program. From this point, Goode's account becomes considerably more elaborate. He has described serving across multiple programs over roughly 2 decades, involving assignments both on Earth and, in his telling, aboard spacecraft and at off-world installations, including claimed postings on the Moon, on Mars, and at various deep space or interstellar locations connected to a rotating set of program names that have shifted somewhat across different interviews. A pattern common across the broader secret space program testimony genre, in which programs are frequently described using code names that Goode has stated he was not always given full context for at the time. Central to this part of his account is a specific and much discussed claim known within the community as the 20 and back program, a term used broadly across several different testifiers in this space, referring to an alleged practice in which an individual serves a 20-year tour of off-world duty and is then returned to almost the exact point in time they left, their memories of the intervening decades either suppressed or restored to their body through advanced technology, such that no time appears to have passed from the perspective of their family, employer, or public record. Goode has stated that he underwent this process himself, and that his conscious memory of the intervening service was later restored, well into adulthood, through age regression and hypnotic recall techniques, rather than being available to him continuously throughout his life. It is worth pausing on this detail specifically, because it is one of the most consequential and most heavily criticized elements of Good's testimony, and it will be addressed again directly in the later part of this documentary, dealing with skepticism and internal disputes within the secret space program community. The 20 and back claim, by its own internal logic, makes Good's account structurally unfalsifiable in a specific way. It explains why there is no public record of his absence, no unaccounted for gap in his life history that outside investigators could independently verify, and no physical evidence of the alleged service, because the entire premise of the program, as described, is designed to erase exactly that kind of evidence. Whether one finds that explanation plausible, or finds it a convenient way to insulate an extraordinary claim from ordinary standards of verification is, again, a judgment this documentary leaves with its audience. But it needs to be stated clearly because it shapes everything that follows. Good's account describes contact over the course of his claimed service with a wide range of non-human groups, not limited to the Blue Avians. He has described interactions with a subterranean, technologically advanced human-like civilization he calls the Anshar, whom he claims exist within vast internal cavern systems beneath Earth's surface and trace their own ancestry to ancient Lemuria and Atlantis. He has described encounters with reptilian beings he associates with a hierarchy he calls the Draco, presented within his account as a controlling, negatively oriented off-world power with long-standing influence over segments of Earth's secret programs, echoing, in general shape, the Orion group described decades earlier in the raw material. He has described contact with a range of other groups, including beings he associates with Sasquatch legends, described in his account as a genuine, intelligent, off-world connected species rather than a purely terrestrial cryptid. Against this backdrop of many alleged contacts, Good has consistently presented his encounters with the Blue Avians, beginning in the fall of 2014, as categorically different from everything that came before, not another faction within a complex, competitive off-world political landscape, but a distinct and, in his framing, uniquely benevolent presence, arriving specifically at that moment because of what he describes as an unprecedented shift already underway in the solar system. Good's public emergence followed a specific and, within this community, well-documented path. He did not initially come forward under his own name. Beginning around 2014, testimony matching his later claims began appearing under the online handle GoodETXSG on internet forums frequented by UFO researchers and secret space program enthusiasts, including sites such as Above Top Secret and Rumor Mill News, where a community already existed around earlier testifiers making related, though distinct, claims about secret off-world programs. It was within this same community that David Wilcock, already an established researcher and author, with a large existing audience built on his work connecting ancient civilizations, esoteric science, and the law of one material, encountered Good's testimony and began a period of what Wilcock has described publicly as extensive vetting, cross-referencing details, meeting with Good directly, and eventually concluding, to his own satisfaction, that the testimony was credible enough to bring to a wider audience under Wilcock's own established platform and reputation. That decision led directly to Cosmic Disclosure, a paid streaming series launched in 2015 on the platform Gaia, structured primarily as a recurring filmed interview format in which Wilcock questioned Good on camera across dozens of episodes, gradually unpacking the full scope of his claimed history, supplemented over time with guest appearances from other figures within the broader secret space program and disclosure research community. Cosmic Disclosure became, over its multi-year run, the single most significant vehicle through which the Blue Avian narrative reached a mass audience, transforming Good's testimony from forum posts read by a relatively small, already committed community into a polished, professionally produced media property with an international subscriber base, translated transcripts, and a level of production value that lent the material a considerably more authoritative surface presentation than its origins as anonymous online testimony might otherwise have carried. It is important, in fairness to the full picture, to note that Good was never the only person making claims of this general kind, and understanding that broader landscape matters for evaluating his specific testimony. The secret space program research community that existed before and alongside Good's emergence included a number of other named testifiers, each describing overlapping but distinct versions of a hidden off-world military and corporate presence. Randy Kramer, who has also used the name Captain K, has described a claimed 20-year career serving on Mars in a program he calls the Earth Defense Force. William Tompkins, a self-described former aerospace engineer who died in 2017, claimed direct knowledge of secret Navy programs involving extraterrestrial contact stretching back to the Second World War and gave extensive on-camera testimony before his death, including appearances alongside Good. Michael Relf and his wife Stephanie have separately described their own 20 and back experiences, including an account of alleged service on Mars, published years before Good's testimony became widely known. These figures do not agree with one another on all details, and in some cases their timelines and program names directly conflict, a point that critics of the secret space program genre as a whole have raised repeatedly, and a point this documentary will return to directly in its dedicated examination of skepticism later in this series. For now, the relevant fact is simply that Good's testimony did not emerge in isolation. It emerged from within and was shaped by a pre-existing community of overlapping claims, terminology, and narrative expectations that had been developing for years before his own account became the version that reached the largest audience. Against this backdrop, the specific claim that gives this documentary its subject, the arrival of the Blue Avians, occupies a distinctive place within Good's overall testimony. It is presented consistently across his interviews and writing, not as one claim among many equally weighted secret space program details, but as the turning point of his entire story. The moment in his account when direct contact with a benevolent non-human intelligence of extraordinary age and spiritual advancement convinced him that the compartmentalized, secretive, and often adversarial world of the programs he had served in needed to be set aside in favor of public testimony, however costly that might be to him personally. Understanding exactly how Good describes that first encounter, the physical description of the being he calls raw tier air, the setting in which the contact allegedly occurred, and the message he says was delivered, is the task of the next part of this documentary. First contact, raw tier air, and the physical description. According to Corey Good's account, his first direct encounter with a being he would come to call raw tier air took place in the fall of 2014, at a point when his involvement with the secret programs he describes was, in his telling, already winding down, and when he had already begun experiencing what he characterized as independent, unsolicited contact from non-human sources outside the formal chain of command he had previously operated within. He has described this contact as occurring in more than one setting across the following months. Sometimes in the company of others, he identifies only in general terms as fellow program insiders or delegates, and at other times in what he describes as a more private, one-on-one encounter aboard one of the spherical objects he associates with the broader alliance the being claimed to represent. The physical description Good has given consistently across interviews, written accounts, and later illustrations produced in collaboration with artists working from his description centers on a being he estimates at roughly 7 feet in height, bipedal and humanoid in basic posture and proportion, but covered across the body in a dense layer of feathers with a distinct blue, often described as iridescent or faintly shifting, coloration catching light in a way Good has compared to the sheen on certain species of grackle or starling, dark blue shifting toward violet or green depending on the angle. The head in his description is distinctly avian rather than humanoid, resembling a bird of prey, with Good and later Wilcock both drawing an explicit comparison in on-camera discussion to the falcon-headed imagery of the Egyptian god Horus discussed earlier in this documentary, as well as to general thunderbird imagery from indigenous North American tradition, a comparison the two men made deliberately, framing the resemblance not as coincidence, but as evidence that the being's true, essential form had been glimpsed and represented, however imperfectly, by human cultures across history. Good has described the being's eyes as a particularly striking element of the encounter, characterizing them as large, dark, and carrying what he has repeatedly called an impression of ancient sorrow layered beneath profound calm, a description that recurs across nearly every account he has given, suggesting either a consistent core memory or, as critics would frame it, a consistently repeated narrative detail refined over many retellings. He has described the being as wearing a simple garment, sometimes described as a robe or tabard-like covering, rather than any form of clothing suggesting technology or military bearing, reinforcing the broader impression Good says he received of a being entirely unconcerned with displays of power or advanced equipment, in deliberate contrast to the highly technological, often militarized environments he claims to have operated within during his earlier program service. Communication, in Good's account, did not occur through spoken language. He has described the exchange as telepathic, though he has been careful across multiple interviews to clarify what he means by that term, stating that the communication did not arrive as words translated one-to-one into English inside his mind, but as compressed packets of concept, emotion, and imagery, which he says he then had to consciously unpack and translate into language himself in order to relay them afterward. A process he acknowledges introduces the possibility of imprecision or personal interpretation into every specific quote or phrase he has attributed to the being since. This is a significant admission, and one worth stating plainly. Virtually nothing Good has reported as having been said by raw-tier air is presented, even by Good himself, as a direct, verifiable quotation. It is presented as his own translation of a non-verbal impression, filtered through his own vocabulary, his own prior exposure to concepts like density and service to others, and his own storytelling choices made in the years since, across dozens of retellings for different interviewers. As for the name itself, Good has explained on several occasions that raw-tier air is not a phonetic transcription of an actual spoken sound, since the being did not communicate through speech at all, but rather his own attempt to render in pronounceable English syllables an impression or identifier that was communicated to him conceptually. He has offered, at different points, slightly varying explanations of how he arrived at the specific spelling and pronunciation used across the Cosmic Disclosure series, a detail that has drawn its own scrutiny from skeptics who note that an entirely internally generated name, arrived at through subjective impression rather than any external, verifiable source, is functionally impossible to independently confirm or dispute. It exists only as Good's own choice, however sincerely made. The emotional character of the encounter, as Good describes it, is consistent across his retellings and forms perhaps the most frequently repeated element of the entire Blue Avian narrative, an overwhelming sense of unconditional love and total non-judgment, described by Good as unlike anything he had experienced in his prior encounters with other non-human groups, many of which he has characterized as cold, transactional, or in some cases actively predatory. He has described feeling, in the presence of raw-tier air, an immediate and total absence of the fear or wariness that had accompanied his other claimed contacts, replaced instead by what he has called a feeling of being fully known and fully accepted, without any sense of being evaluated, judged, or found wanting. A description that closely echoes the emotional register found throughout the raw material discussed in the previous part of this documentary, which repeatedly emphasizes unconditional love and the deliberate avoidance of any imposition of judgment as core to the Confederation's service to others orientation. Good's account does not describe a single encounter and then silence. He has stated that contact continued intermittently over an extended period following the initial meeting in 2014, sometimes involving further one-on-one exchanges, and sometimes, in his account, involving larger gatherings at which delegates from various Earth-based factions and other off-world groups were present, with the Blue Avians and the broader Sphere Being Alliance serving in what he has described as an observational, moderating role at these gatherings rather than a directly interventionist one. He has referenced, though in less developed detail than his descriptions of raw-tier air specifically, encounters with what he describes as additional members of the same species without providing the same level of individualized description he has given for the single figure who became the recurring named spokesperson of the entire narrative. Content-wise, Good has described these continuing contacts as involving the transmission of information well beyond a simple introductory greeting, impressions, and, in some cases, what he has described as visionary or dreamlike sequences conveying aspects of Earth's deep history, the broader structure of non-human civilizations currently active in the solar system, and the nature of the shift he says the Sphere Being Alliance's arrival was tied to. Much of this material overlaps directly with content already introduced through the raw material and, before that, through Casey's readings. Density, harvest, the choice between service orientations, and a coming period of significant transformation tied to humanity's collective spiritual development. Later parts of this documentary will examine that specific content in detail, including the philosophical teachings Good attributes directly to the Blue Avians and how closely, phrase for phrase, they track the material already covered in this series. Before moving to that content, however, one further element of Good's account needs to be placed on the record because it forms the immediate physical and cosmological backdrop against which the entire Blue Avian story is set. The claim that the Blue Avian's arrival was not an isolated event, but was accompanied by the appearance of a much larger phenomenon. Massive, cloaked spherical objects, some reportedly larger than gas giant planets, entering the solar system beginning around 2012, tracked, according to Good, by both public and classified space monitoring systems, and interpreted within his testimony as physical manifestations of the broader alliance the Blue Avians represent. That claim, the specific evidence offered for it, and the broader concept of the Sphere Being Alliance itself, is the subject of the next part of this documentary. The Sphere Being Alliance and the claimed 2012 arrival. The Blue Avians, in Corey Good's account, are never presented as a single isolated species making unilateral contact with one man. They are presented as the public-facing representatives of a much larger coalition, one Good and David Wilcock named, over the course of their collaboration, the Sphere Being Alliance. A term that refers, in this narrative, both to the beings themselves and to a specific, physically described phenomenon that Good claims began appearing in the solar system starting around 2012, several years before his testimony about direct contact with raw-tier air began. According to Good, beginning in that period, massive spherical objects, some described as comparable in scale to large moons, others reportedly larger still, began entering the solar system in significant numbers, positioning themselves near planets including Jupiter and Saturn, and in some tellings closer to Earth's own orbital neighborhood. These objects, in Good's account, are cloaked, meaning they are not visible to conventional observation under ordinary circumstances, but he and Wilcock have claimed, across numerous episodes of Cosmic Disclosure and in Wilcock's own separate writing, that their presence has occasionally been captured, in partial or distorted form, in publicly available imagery from NASA and other space agency instruments, including the SOHO and Stereo solar observation satellites, which are operated to monitor the sun and track solar weather rather than to search for anomalous objects, but whose raw image data is nonetheless publicly accessible and has, for years, been mined by online communities looking for exactly this kind of anomaly. The purpose attributed to these spheres within Good's narrative extends beyond simple transportation or observation. He has described them as playing an active role in what he characterizes as an energetic transformation affecting the entire solar system, a claimed increase in background cosmic energy, tied in his account to shifts in solar activity, changes in the behavior of other planets' magnetic fields and atmospheres, and a general acceleration of what the broader narrative refers to as consciousness raising, a process said to be affecting not just individual human beings, but the collective psychological and spiritual condition of the species as a whole. This framing connects directly and explicitly back to material already covered in this documentary, the density and harvest framework introduced by the raw material in 1981, and to a lesser and more oblique extent, the Earth changes concept present in Edgar Cayce's readings decades before that. In Good's telling, the spheres are best understood as an outward physical sign of an inward spiritual process already described by those earlier sources, evidence to a sympathetic audience that the philosophical framework inherited from Cayce and Ra was not merely metaphor, but was now manifesting as literal, trackable, physical activity in the sky. It is worth situating this claim within David Wilcock's own personal history because it did not originate with Good. Well before the two men ever collaborated, Wilcock had already built a substantial public following around the broader idea of a coming 2012-era shift in human consciousness, connected loosely to popular, non-academic interpretations of the Mayan long count calendar that circulated widely in the years leading up to December 21, 2012. A date that received enormous popular attention across books, documentaries, and internet discussion as a supposed marker of major planetary transformation, ranging from literal apocalyptic predictions to softer, more common New Age interpretations describing it as a symbolic threshold for a shift in collective human awareness rather than a physical catastrophe. Wilcock was one of the more prominent voices in that specific strand of the broader 2012 phenomenon, publishing material and giving lectures in the years before that date describing an approaching planetary ascension event tied to increased solar and cosmic energy, largely consistent in its underlying structure with the density and harvest framework of the raw material he had already spent years studying. When Good's testimony arrived in 2014, describing a physical sphere-based phenomenon that had allegedly begun exactly around the widely publicized 2012 threshold, it did not introduce an unfamiliar concept to Wilcock. It offered him what appeared to be direct testimonial evidence for a transformation he had already spent years telling audiences was underway, based on a largely separate body of interpretive and channeled material. The specific imagery presented as evidence for the spheres deserves direct examination because it represents one of the few points in this entire narrative where a concrete, checkable claim is being made, not simply an assertion of private testimony, but a pointer toward publicly available data that anyone can, in principle, examine independently. The images most frequently cited across cosmic disclosure episodes and related online discussion tend to show bright, roughly circular or spherical artifacts near the sun in SOHO and stereo satellite frames. Working astronomers, along with NASA's own public affairs statements on the subject over the years, have consistently identified the overwhelming majority of these artifacts as one of a small number of well-understood phenomena, lens flares and internal reflections caused by bright sunlight interacting with the satellite's optical instruments, background stars and planets appearing as bright points due to the long exposure times used in solar imaging, cosmic ray hits directly striking the satellite's imaging sensor and appearing as small bright dots or streaks in individual frames, and, in a number of well-documented cases, sun-grazing comets, a known and regularly observed class of small icy bodies that pass extremely close to the sun and are frequently captured by exactly these instruments before disintegrating. None of these mainstream explanations require the existence of a cloaked, artificial, moon-sized object, and no peer-reviewed astronomical research, and no publicly documented NASA or other space agency finding has identified or confirmed any of the imagery cited within this community as evidence of an artificial sphere of the kind Good describes. This does not mean every individual anomaly in decades of publicly available solar imagery has been perfectly and exhaustively explained. Imaging artifacts, sensor glitches, and genuinely unidentified transient phenomena do occur in large datasets of this kind and raise legitimate, narrower questions that working scientists continue to investigate through ordinary channels. What it does mean is that the specific, sweeping claim made within the Blue Avian narrative that this imagery collectively demonstrates the presence of a coordinated, intelligent, artificial sphere alliance entering the solar system beginning in 2012 goes considerably further than the available evidence supports and rests far more heavily on interpretation, motivated by a pre-existing narrative framework, than on anything approaching independent confirmation. This is a pattern that recurs throughout ancient astronaut and disclosure-adjacent research more broadly, not just within this specific story. Ambiguous, genuinely unexplained, or simply misunderstood data is presented to an audience already primed by years of prior narrative building to interpret it in the most dramatic available way, and the resulting interpretation then circulates as though it were the more parsimonious or obvious reading, rather than one of several possible explanations, most of which are considerably more mundane. Within the internal structure of Good's narrative, the sphere-being alliance is described as including species and civilizations beyond the Blue Avians, though none of the others have received anywhere close to the same level of detailed description, individual naming, or sustained public attention. The Blue Avians, and specifically the single figure of Raw Tier Air, function within the story as the Alliance's primary spokesperson and public face, the entity through which the broader coalition's intentions and philosophy are communicated to Good, and through him to the audience. This concentration of narrative weight onto a single, vividly described, visually striking figure is worth noting as a storytelling choice in its own right, independent of any judgment about the underlying truth of the claim. A 7-foot, iridescent blue, falcon-headed being carrying echoes of Horus and the Thunderbird is a considerably more memorable and shareable image than an abstract description of an alliance or a diffuse cloud of unnamed off-world civilizations, and its resonance with the ancient mythological record covered earlier in this documentary gives it a kind of borrowed gravity that a more generic description would not carry on its own. The stated purpose the sphere-being alliance and the Blue Avians hold within this narrative, beyond the general energetic and consciousness-related transformation already described, centers on what Good and Wilcock refer to across their material as full disclosure, a hoped-for future point at which secret programs, hidden technology, and the true extent of non-human contact with Earth would be made openly public, ending what the narrative characterizes as a decades-long pattern of concealment maintained by a combination of military, intelligence, and corporate interests. The Blue Avians are described, within this framework, as broadly supportive of disclosure occurring, though committed to a policy of non-interference that prevents them from forcing the issue directly, consistent with the free will and non-interventionist principles already established in the raw material discussed earlier in this documentary. This stated policy of restraint has an important secondary function within the narrative's internal logic. It explains, without requiring further evidence, why no large-scale public confirmation of the spheres, the Blue Avians, or the broader alliance has occurred despite years of testimony describing their presence. The beings, according to the story's own rules, are choosing not to reveal themselves more directly, precisely because doing so would violate the very principle of non-interference that makes them trustworthy in the first place. That structure, a claim built to explain, in advance, why direct confirming evidence will not be forthcoming, is one of the most consistent features running through every layer of this narrative, from the 20 and back program discussed in the previous part to the cloaked spheres discussed here. And it is a structural feature this documentary will return to directly when it turns to sustained skepticism and internal criticism later in this series. Before reaching that point, however, the full philosophical content attributed to the Blue Avians deserves closer, dedicated treatment of its own. The specific teachings on ascension, non-interference, and unconditional love that Good says were communicated to him, and how completely, phrase by phrase, they align with material this documentary has already traced back to Casey and to Ra. That detailed examination is the subject of the next part. The teachings, ascension, non-interference, and tag your it. Strip away the physical description, the spacecraft, and the secret programs, and what remains of the Blue Avian narrative is a philosophy, a specific set of teachings that Corey Good says were communicated to him, primarily by Raw Tier Air, across his claimed encounters. Examining that philosophy closely and comparing it directly against the material this documentary has already traced through Edgar Cayce and the Raw channelings is essential to understanding what the Blue Avians are actually said to represent beyond their striking appearance. The single most frequently repeated teaching attributed to the Blue Avians, recurring across Good's interviews, his written statements, and Wilcox's own summaries on cosmic disclosure, is a rejection of external rescue. Good has stated, in numerous retellings, that Raw-Tier Air and the broader alliance were explicit and consistent in communicating that humanity should not expect or wait for the Blue Avians or any other outside group to solve its problems on its behalf. He has attributed to the being a phrase that has since become one of the most quoted lines associated with the entire narrative within its fan community. "Tag, you're it," delivered, according to Good, as a way of communicating that responsibility for humanity's own transformation had effectively been handed back to humanity itself, and that the era of waiting for saviors, whether religious, political, or extraterrestrial, needed to end. This theme extends into a second, closely related teaching that Good and Wilcox have both emphasized repeatedly, that the Blue Avians explicitly and repeatedly refused any framing that cast them as objects of worship, reverence, or messianic expectation. Good has described the beings as actively uncomfortable with and resistant to any tendency among the humans they contacted to treat them as gods or saviors, insisting instead that any spiritual authority or divinity being sought lay within each individual human being rather than in an external, more advanced species. Within the internal logic of the story, this rejection of worship functions as a significant piece of evidence for the being's benevolence, since a predatory or self-serving intelligence, according to the framework inherited from the raw material, would be expected to encourage dependency, deference, and worship as a means of exerting influence, whereas a genuinely service-to-others-oriented being would do the opposite, deliberately steering those it contacted away from dependency and towards self-responsibility. This is a coherent piece of internal reasoning, consistent with the broader philosophical architecture already established by Ra decades earlier, and it is one of the more philosophically interesting elements of the entire narrative, regardless of what one concludes about its ultimate source. A third recurring theme concerns what the narrative calls ascension, a concept referring not to physical departure from Earth, but to a claimed shift in collective human consciousness toward greater unity, compassion, and awareness, understood within this framework as both an individual spiritual practice and a larger, species-wide process already underway. Good has described the Blue Avians as consistently encouraging practices associated with raising one's personal vibration, a term used loosely across this material to describe cultivating states of love, gratitude, forgiveness, and inner peace, understood within the narrative's cosmology as literally affecting one's spiritual density and readiness for the harvest event, described in the raw material discussed earlier in this documentary. Meditation, service to others in the form of everyday kindness and community support, and deliberate emotional and psychological healing work are all presented across Good's retellings as the practical, everyday instructions the Blue Avians are said to have emphasized far more than any specific political or technological program, a notably modest and unspectacular set of recommendations given the extraordinary framing of the beings delivering them. Closely tied to ascension is a further concept the narrative calls the event, a term used across Good's testimony and Wilcox's broader commentary to describe a hoped-for future moment of mass awakening in which concealed information about secret programs, hidden technology, and humanity's true relationship with non-human civilizations would become undeniable and widely known all at once, rather than emerging gradually. Descriptions of the event vary considerably across different tellings and different figures within the broader disclosure community, ranging from a primarily internal, psychological, and spiritual shift in collective awareness to more elaborate versions circulating in adjacent corners of this same online community that tie the concept to claims of an imminent global financial system reset, mass arrests of corrupt officials, and other far more concrete, politically charged predictions. It is worth noting directly that Good and Wilcox's own core testimony keeps this concept relatively restrained compared to some of its wider circulation elsewhere online, generally describing the event in terms closer to a spiritual and informational unveiling than a specific dated geopolitical prediction, though the concept has, in practice, been picked up, elaborated, and in some cases considerably distorted by other voices within the broader conspiracy-adjacent media ecosystem that has grown up around this general community in the years since. The principle of non-interference, already introduced in the discussion of the raw material, receives its most detailed and repeated treatment within the specific context of the Blue Avian teachings. Good has described the beings as bound by what he calls a strict non-interference directive, preventing them from taking direct action to expose secret programs, correct human governments, or otherwise intervene in human affairs beyond offering guidance, information, and what he describes as energetic support to those individuals and groups working toward positive change from within human society itself. This closely mirrors, in both substance and specific phrasing, the Confederation's stated policy in the raw material, which likewise emphasizes that any assistance offered to a third density world must be requested rather than imposed, out of respect for that world's collective free will. Within the Blue Avian narrative, this principle also performs important narrative work beyond its philosophical content. It explains, without requiring further justification, why an alliance described as powerful enough to track a solar system-wide energetic transformation and benevolent enough to guide humanity toward a better future has not simply ended war, corruption, or suffering directly, a question that any sufficiently curious listener might otherwise be expected to ask. A further teaching attributed to the Blue Avians concerns the nature of negatively oriented or predatory off-world influence, generally discussed in Good's testimony in connection with the reptilian Draco hierarchy and other groups he associates with the earlier stages of his claimed secret program service. The Blue Avians are described as warning, in general terms, against fear, division, and susceptibility to manipulation by these negatively oriented forces, framing personal and collective psychological resilience, freedom from fear, cultivated through the same inner practices already described, as the primary defense available to humanity rather than any external military or technological countermeasure. This again closely tracks the raw material's own treatment of the Orion group, which likewise frames psychological and spiritual polarization rather than direct confrontation as the central axis on which the outcome of any negative influence ultimately turns. Taken as a whole, the philosophical content attributed to the Blue Avians is notably light on specific, falsifiable claims and correspondingly heavy on general spiritual encouragement. Cultivate love, take responsibility for your own growth, do not wait for rescue, resist fear, and trust that a larger positive process is already underway. This is not in itself unusual or suspicious as a spiritual message. Versions of this same encouragement appear across an enormous range of both mainstream and alternative spiritual traditions with no connection to UFO testimony at all. What makes it relevant to a documentary specifically examining the credibility and originality of the Blue Avian claim is the closeness of its specific vocabulary and structure to the raw material that preceded it by more than 3 decades, and the fact that this vocabulary arrived in the public record already fully formed, attributed to direct, private, telepathic contact that by its own description cannot be independently verified, translated, or checked against any external record. None of this proves the teachings are false, and it would be a mistake for this documentary to overstate its own conclusions on a question this fundamentally unresolvable. It is entirely possible, within the logic of the narrative itself, that Ra and the Blue Avians represent genuinely separate, independent sources converging on the same underlying spiritual truth, exactly as Good has suggested. It is also possible, and arguably the more parsimonious explanation available given everything traced across this documentary so far. The mythological borrowing, the reinterpreted Hopi prophecy, the direct terminological inheritance from Casey and Ra, and Wilcox's own decades-long, well-documented immersion in exactly this vocabulary before he ever met Good, that the Blue Avian teachings represent a retelling rather than an independent rediscovery of a philosophical system already well established within the community that received and popularized the testimony. Having now traced the full arc of what the Blue Avians are said to look like, how contact allegedly occurred, and what they are said to teach, this documentary turns next to a body of material it has so far only referenced in passing, the direct, sustained skepticism and internal criticism this story has generated, including specific, named disputes from other figures within Good's own secret space program community, and the broader credibility questions that have followed Corey Goode across the years since his testimony first became public. Credibility, conflict, and the courtroom. No account of the Blue Avians would be complete or honest without a direct examination of the skepticism this story has generated, not only from outside critics dismissing the entire genre of secret space program testimony, but from people inside the same research community that Corey Goode emerged from, some of whom have publicly and specifically disputed his claims, his consistency, and in some cases his basic honesty. The most significant and widely circulated critique came in 2017 when Bill Ryan, a longtime UFO researcher and co-founder of the Project Camelot interview platform, one of the original venues that had helped build an audience for secret space program testimony years before Goode's account became widely known, published a lengthy public article titled "The Truth About Corey Goode." In it, Ryan concluded, based on his own personal interactions with Goode and his analysis of Goode's early public statements, that Goode's testimony was compromised and inauthentic. Ryan went further, suggesting that Goode may have been an unwitting participant in a broader pattern he associated with claims made by mind control researcher Robert Duncan, describing a form of psychological targeting that, according to this theory, deliberately identifies vulnerable or already compromised individuals and encourages them to come forward with sensational, unverifiable claims, with the effect, whether intentional or not, of discrediting more careful and cautious UFO research by association. Ryan's article, and the extended interview he gave discussing it on the Dark Journalist YouTube program shortly afterward, spread widely within the same online community that had helped build Goode's platform in the first place, prompting a wave of responses both defending and further criticizing Goode. One of the more substantive threads to emerge from that response involved a specific pointed question raised by Carrie Cassidy, Ryan's former Project Camelot co-founder, who, while pushing back against some of Ryan's specific claims and defending the general value of whistleblower testimony, nonetheless raised a direct challenge of her own. Whether Goode was, in her words, an original source of the information he was presenting, or whether he was drawing on and restating testimony and research that had already been circulating within the community from other researchers. She pointed specifically to comments from Joseph Farrell, an independent researcher and author who had been active in this space for years before Goode's public emergence, who stated in a recorded interview that portions of Goode's testimony closely matched his own prior research and writing. This is a meaningfully different kind of criticism than a simple accusation of fabrication from nothing. It raises the possibility that Goode's account, whatever its origin, may have been substantially assembled from material already available within the community, rather than delivered fresh through direct, independent contact. A criticism that echoes, in a more immediate and specific way, the deeper structural pattern this documentary has already traced through Casey and the raw material. Separately, and more broadly, established researchers in the wider UFO and secret history research field, including Richard Dolan, a historian known for his more archivally grounded approach to UFO research, and Catherine Austin Fitz, a former federal official turned independent researcher known for her work tracing unexplained government spending, have both been publicly associated with a more cautious, document and record-based standard of evidence, one that treats uncorroborated personal testimony, however sincerely delivered, as a fundamentally different and less reliable category of evidence than paper trails, financial records, or physical documentation. Neither Dolan nor Fitz needed to single out Goode specifically to make this point. The distinction they draw applies to any testimony of this kind, and it identifies precisely the evidentiary gap that runs through the entire Blue Avian narrative, from the 20 and Back program discussed earlier in this documentary, through the cloaked spheres, to the private, unverifiable telepathic content of the encounters with Raw Tear Air himself. The dispute between Good and his own former research community eventually moved beyond blog posts and YouTube interviews into a considerably more consequential arena: a federal courtroom. In 2018, after several years co-hosting Cosmic Disclosure, Good's relationship with Gaia, the streaming platform that had built and distributed the series, broke down. Good has stated, in later legal filings, that his departure followed mistreatment by a senior Gaia employee, including an incident he described as involving intimidation. Gaia, for its part, has disputed his characterization of events. Whatever the precise cause, the professional relationship that had done more than any other single factor to bring the Blue Avian story to a mass audience came to an end, and it did not end quietly. In March of 2020, Good filed a lawsuit against Gaia in federal court in Colorado, alleging that the company had engaged in a coordinated effort against him following his departure. Gaia responded with a countersuit, accusing Good of defamation, pointing specifically to public statements in which Good had accused Gaia executives of practicing what he described using language associated with satanic ritual abuse conspiracy narratives, allegations Gaia strongly denied and characterized as damaging and false. A significant portion of the underlying legal dispute centered on control of the specific vocabulary this entire narrative is built from. Good had filed to trademark terms including Secret Space Program, 20 and Back, Sphere Being Alliance, and Blue Avians itself, seeking exclusive commercial rights to language that had, by that point, been used for years by a wider community of researchers, testifiers, and fans, including Gaia, which had hired a new host to continue similar programming after Good's departure. Using much of the same terminology, Good was now attempting to claim as his own intellectual property. This detail is worth sitting with directly because it cuts to one of the more uncomfortable tensions running underneath the entire Blue Avian phenomenon. The same story that positions itself as urgent, world-altering testimony about humanity's true cosmic situation was also, simultaneously, being actively managed and litigated as a commercial property, complete with trademark filings, a graphic novel line produced through a company Good co-founded called Disclosure Comics, branded merchandise, and stated plans discussed publicly by Good himself to develop the material into films and video games. None of this, on its own, proves the underlying testimony false. Plenty of genuine historical events have gone on to generate books, films, and merchandise without that commercial afterlife retroactively disproving the events themselves. But the scale and specificity of the intellectual property claims, particularly the attempt to assert exclusive commercial ownership over terms describing what was presented to the public as objectively real, ongoing extraterrestrial contact, struck many longtime observers within the community as difficult to reconcile with the story's own stated stakes. The single most consequential and most frequently cited detail to emerge from the litigation concerns sworn deposition testimony given by Good as part of the legal proceedings. According to multiple secondhand reports that circulated publicly after portions of the deposition became available, Good stated under oath, in the specific context of establishing his legal ownership of the Blue Avians and related material as intellectual property, that the material constituted his own creative work. This claim has been reported and discussed extensively within the wider disclosure and UFO research community in the years since, and it has become, for critics, one of the most direct pieces of evidence available that the Blue Avian narrative was, at least in part, an invented creative work rather than a description of genuine events. Good's supporters have offered a different reading, arguing that this testimony reflected a legal strategy necessary to protect his material under intellectual property law, a framework not designed to accommodate claims of literal, ongoing contact with non-human beings, rather than a genuine admission that the underlying experiences never occurred. This documentary cannot independently verify the precise wording or full context of that deposition testimony, and it is presented here as a widely reported and significant point of dispute, rather than as an independently confirmed fact in its own right. What is not in dispute is that the testimony exists, that it was given under oath in a federal legal proceeding, and that it has become a central and unavoidable reference point in any serious discussion of Good's credibility since. Taken together, this body of internal and external criticism describes a consistent and recurring pattern, claims structured in a way that resists external verification by design, close and unexplained overlap with pre-existing material from other sources, direct and specific disputes from other researchers within the same community about originality and consistency, and a legal record that, at minimum, complicates any simple reading of the Blue Avian story as straightforward, disinterested testimony. None of this constitutes definitive proof that Corey Goode never experienced anything he has described, and this documentary is not in a position to make that determination on his behalf. It does mean that any account of the Blue Avians that omits this material, the internal community disputes, the credibility questions raised by figures like Bill Ryan and Joseph Farrell, and the specific documented legal history culminating in a federal lawsuit over ownership of the very name Blue Avians, would be leaving out information essential to forming an informed view of the story. Despite all of this, the Blue Avian narrative did not remain confined to a small, contested corner of internet forums and legal filings. It grew, over the course of the 2010s, into a genuine cultural phenomenon within the broader alternative spirituality and UFO research community, generating its own conferences, its own artwork, its own online following, and its own place within a much longer American tradition of contactee movements describing benevolent visitors from the stars. That growth and the deeper historical pattern it fits into is the subject of the next two parts of this documentary. Cultural spread, conferences, fandom, and the replication problem. Whatever conclusions one draws about the underlying credibility of Corey Goode's testimony, the cultural footprint the Blue Avian story left behind is not in dispute. Within a few years of its first appearance in 2014 and 2015, it had grown from a single testifier's account, circulating on niche internet forums, into a recognizable fixture of a much larger alternative media ecosystem, complete with its own conferences, its own visual iconography, its own dedicated online communities, and, notably, its own additional testifiers describing remarkably similar experiences. The conference circuit played a significant role in this spread. Events such as Contact in the Desert, an annual gathering held in Southern California that draws together speakers and attendees from across the UFO research, ancient astronaut, and consciousness communities, became a recurring venue where Goode and Wilcock appeared, sometimes separately and sometimes together, presenting updates on the ongoing narrative to live audiences numbering in the thousands. These appearances functioned differently than the filmed, edited format of Cosmic Disclosure. They placed Goode in front of a large, engaged, paying audience, many of whom had already watched years of the television series and arrived with detailed prior knowledge of the story's internal vocabulary, allowing him to build on and extend the narrative in real time, responding to audience questions and, in some cases, introducing new details about the Sphere Being Alliance, the Blue Avians, or related figures that had not previously appeared in the televised material. Conference appearances of this kind became, over time, one of the primary channels through which the story continued to develop, even as the relationship with Gaia deteriorated and eventually collapsed into litigation. Gaia's own platform reach amplified the story considerably beyond what independent internet testimony alone could have achieved. Operating as a publicly traded subscription streaming service built originally around yoga and meditation content, before expanding heavily into paranormal and alternative history programming, Gaia gave Cosmic Disclosure a production budget, professional editing, consistent release scheduling, and searchable, binge-watchable archive access that positioned it closer to genuine documentary documentary television than to the forum posts and low-budget webcam interviews that had characterized most prior secret space program testimony. This production quality mattered for the story's spread in a way that is easy to underestimate. A polished, professionally lit interview series with recurring hosts, graphics, and thematic scoring carries an implicit signal of legitimacy to many viewers, independent of the actual verifiability of its content, simply by resembling the visual conventions of trustworthy documentary media rather than the more obviously amateur presentation of earlier testimony in this space. Visually, the Blue Avians themselves became one of the more recognizable and widely reproduced images to emerge from this entire corner of internet culture. Fan-commissioned artwork depicting raw-tier air and other Blue Avians, produced by illustrators working directly from Good's verbal descriptions, circulated widely across social media, forums, and eventually Good's own comic book imprint, Disclosure Comics, which produced illustrated material depicting the beings in a polished, professional style closer to mainstream graphic novel art than typical fan-made conspiracy content. This visual consistency mattered for the narrative's cultural staying power, in much the same way the production quality of Cosmic Disclosure did. A striking, well-rendered, and consistently reproduced image is considerably easier for a community to organize around, share, and recognize than a purely verbal description would be, and it gave the Blue Avians a kind of visual brand identity that few comparable claims within this broader genre have achieved. Perhaps the most significant and most directly documented aspect of the story's cultural spread is also the most analytically important: the appearance of additional independent testifiers describing encounters strikingly similar to Good's own. The most notable example emerged directly out of the Gaia dispute itself. After Good's departure from the platform in 2018, Gaia continued producing similar programming with a new host, Jason Rice, who has described in terms closely paralleling Good's own account, having been recruited as a child empath into a secret program and having encountered Blue Avians during his own claimed service. This detail became one of the central points of contention in the subsequent litigation between Good and Gaia, with Good's side characterizing Rice's testimony as an unauthorized appropriation of his own original account and raising, whether intentionally or not, one of the more analytically important questions available anywhere in this entire narrative. If two separate individuals can independently produce closely overlapping detailed testimony about a secretive off-world program and an extraordinarily specific alien race, does that overlap constitute corroboration of a genuine shared reality, or does it instead reflect the well-documented human tendency to absorb, internalize, and eventually reproduce a sufficiently vivid and widely circulated cultural narrative as though it were an independent personal experience? This is not a new question in the study of extraordinary claims, and it is worth naming the established pattern this situation fits into because it recurs throughout the broader history of paranormal and contact testimony. Researchers studying the alien abduction phenomenon that grew rapidly in American culture following the 1987 publication of Whitley Strieber's Communion, and the earlier, less widely known Barney and Betty Hill case from 1961, have long observed that the specific imagery associated with abduction experiences, gray-skinned beings, large black eyes, medical examination tables, shows a documented historical progression, becoming increasingly standardized and consistent across independent reports only after that specific imagery had already been widely publicized through books, television, and film. Before that popularization, earlier accounts of anomalous nighttime experiences and missing time were considerably more varied in their described imagery, often drawing on culturally available frameworks entirely distinct from the extraterrestrial abduction narrative, including, in earlier historical periods, folkloric accounts of nighttime visitation by demons, incubi, or the so-called old hag phenomenon associated with sleep paralysis across many different cultures and centuries. The pattern researchers describe is not necessarily one of conscious lying, but of a documented psychological process in which a sufficiently detailed and emotionally resonant cultural narrative provides a ready-made interpretive framework that shapes how subsequent, genuinely felt but ambiguous experiences get understood, remembered, and eventually reported. A process that does not require any of the individuals involved to be acting in bad faith, Applied to the Blue Avian case specifically, this pattern raises a genuinely difficult interpretive question that this documentary cannot resolve on the audience's behalf. It is possible that Jason Rice and any other individuals within this community who have since described similar encounters are independently corroborating a genuine underlying phenomenon that Good was simply the first to describe publicly. It is equally possible and consistent with a well-established body of research into how narrative frameworks shape subsequent testimony in other paranormal contexts that a sufficiently vivid, emotionally compelling, and widely circulated account, amplified by a professionally produced television series reaching a large and receptive audience, created exactly the conditions under which later, similar testimony would be expected to emerge. Whether or not any of it reflects an independent underlying reality, distinguishing between these two explanations from the outside using only the testimony itself is not possible, which is precisely why researchers studying this broader category of claims have increasingly emphasized the need for evidence beyond personal testimony, however sincere and however numerous the testifiers. Beyond the immediate secret space program and disclosure research community, the Blue Avian story also drew attention from mainstream journalism, though largely in the register of cultural curiosity or investigative skepticism rather than credulous coverage. Outlets including Vice's Motherboard Vertical and the Daily Beast covered aspects of the story over the years, particularly once the Gaia litigation became public record, treating it less as a serious claim requiring evaluation on its own terms and more as a case study in the commercialization and internal politics of contemporary conspiracy culture. Coverage that, while often skeptical in tone, nonetheless extended the story's reach considerably further than it would otherwise have traveled, introducing the Blue Avians to audiences who had never encountered cosmic disclosure or the broader secret space program community directly. Taken together, this pattern of spread, professional production values, a visually consistent and widely reproduced central image, conference culture reinforcing and extending the narrative in real time, additional testifiers echoing closely similar claims, and periodic mainstream media attention driven as much by internal community conflict as by the underlying claim itself, describes a story that succeeded, by any reasonable measure, as a piece of cultural transmission, whatever judgment one ultimately reaches about its factual accuracy. That success did not happen in a vacuum, and it did not happen for the first time in human history. Stories of benevolent beings from beyond Earth, arriving with warnings and reassurances about humanity's future, have a long and well-documented history in 20th century American culture that predates Corey Goode by more than 6 decades. Understanding that earlier tradition and how closely the Blue Avian narrative follows its established shape is the subject of the next part of this documentary. The Space Brothers, Adamski, Meyer, and the Ashtar Command. Corey Goode was not the first person to describe contact with a benevolent, physically striking, non-human intelligence bearing spiritual guidance for a troubled humanity. That claim has a documented history stretching back more than 60 years before his own account, through a lineage of what researchers in the field generally call the contactee movement. And understanding that lineage in detail makes clear just how closely the Blue Avian narrative follows an established, well-worn template, right down to many of its specific structural beats. The contactee tradition is generally traced to George Adamski, a Polish-American man living in Southern California who, in November of 1952, claimed to have made physical contact with an extraterrestrial visitor in the desert near Desert Center, California. Adamski described the being, whom he later identified as a Venusian named Orthon, as strikingly human in appearance. Tall, fair-skinned, and long-haired, dressed in a ski suit-like garment, communicating primarily through telepathy and gesture rather than spoken language. Adamski published his account, along with a series of photographs he claimed depicted the Venusians' scout ship in the 1953 book Flying Saucers Have Landed, co-authored with British writer Desmond Leslie, which became a foundational text for the entire genre that followed. Adamski's alleged extraterrestrial visitors delivered a message that would become a recurring template across the decades to come. They expressed grave concern over humanity's development and testing of nuclear weapons, warned that continued aggression and militarism could lead to catastrophe, and urged spiritual growth, brotherhood, and peace as the path toward a better future. A message tailored precisely to the anxieties of its Cold War moment, delivered by beings whose physical appearance was reassuringly, almost aspirationally, human. Adamski's photographic evidence did not hold up well under later scrutiny. Photographic analysts and skeptical investigators examining his published images over the years since identified design elements in his claimed scout ship photographs closely matching mass-produced household items available at the time, including a widely repeated analysis suggesting components resembling a chicken brooder lamp fixture and other everyday hardware. This did not end Adamski's career or his following. He continued lecturing, writing, and claiming further contact experiences, including an eventual claimed meeting with beings from multiple planets, until his death in 1965. And he remains, whatever the status of his specific photographic claims, the figure most historians of ufology point to as the founder of the entire contactee genre. The first widely known case of an individual claiming personal, repeated, benevolent contact with human-appearing extraterrestrials, bearing a spiritual and political message for humanity as a whole. A second, closely related tradition emerged in roughly the same period through George Van Tassel, another Southern California figure who, beginning in 1952, claimed ongoing telepathic contact with a being identifying itself as Ashtar, described as the commander of an enormous benevolent space fleet operating under a coalition. Van Tassel and later channelers would come to describe using language strikingly similar to the Confederation described decades later in the raw material discussed earlier in this documentary. Van Tassel organized what became known as the Giant Rock UFO Conventions, held annually in the Mojave Desert throughout the 1950s and into the 1970s, drawing thousands of attendees at their peak and functioning as one of the earliest and most significant gathering points for the broader UFO contactee community in the United States. Unlike Adamski's specific, individually authored testimony, the Ashtar material developed over subsequent decades into something closer to an open, evolving channeling tradition taken up and extended by numerous different channelers across the following 50 years, including notably a channeler using the name Tuella, who published extensively on what came to be called the Ashtar Command throughout the 1980s. This diffuse, multi-author quality distinguishes the Ashtar tradition from the more centralized, single testifier structure of both Adamski's and later, Good's accounts. But the underlying thematic content, a vast, benevolent, hierarchically organized space fleet concerned with humanity's moral and spiritual development, oriented around themes of unity, love, and planetary transformation, maps with remarkable consistency onto the same territory the Blue Avian story would later occupy. A third major figure in this lineage, and in several respects the closest direct precedent to Good's testimony, is Eduard Billy Meyer, a Swiss farmer who has claimed, beginning in 1975 and continuing for decades since, ongoing contact with a group of extraterrestrials he describes as originating from the Pleiades star cluster, whom he refers to using the term Plejaran, most famously involving a female contact he calls Semyase. Meyer produced an enormous volume of claimed photographic and later video evidence purporting to show the Pleiadian beam ships involved in his contacts, material that has been extensively analyzed by both supporters and skeptical investigators over nearly 5 decades. The mainstream skeptical assessment, shared by the great majority of professional ufologists who have examined the material, is that Meyer's photographs show small models, frequently interpreted as suspended on wires or otherwise staged using miniature effects. Though Meyer and his organization, the Free Community of Interests for the Border and Spiritual Sciences and Ufological Studies, generally known by its German acronym FIGU, maintains an active following to this day and continues to defend the material's authenticity. Meyer's contact narrative, like Adamski's before it, blends specific claimed physical evidence with an extensive body of channeled or telepathically received spiritual and prophetic teaching, addressing themes of human moral failure, coming planetary crisis, and the possibility of guided transformation through contact with a more spiritually advanced off-world civilization. Again, the same basic shape that would recur in Good's testimony 40 years later. Laid side by side, these three traditions, Adamski's Venusian contact, the Ashtar command channeling lineage, and Meyer's Pleiadian encounters, share a recognizable and consistent structure that the Blue Avian narrative reproduces closely, feature for feature. In each case, contact is granted not to an institution, a government, or a scientific body, but to a single, otherwise ordinary individual who becomes the primary and often sole channel through which the wider public receives the information. In each case, the beings involved are described as physically striking and immediately distinguishable from ordinary humans, whether through unusual human-like beauty, as with Adamski's Orthon and Meyer's Semjase, or through a wholly non-human but symbolically resonant form, as with the Blue Avians. In each case, the being's central message centers on humanity standing at a critical moral and spiritual threshold, requiring inner transformation, love, unity, the rejection of aggression and materialism, as the necessary path toward avoiding catastrophe and achieving a better collective future. And in each case, claimed physical evidence, where it exists at all, has faced sustained and largely unresolved skeptical challenge. Without that challenge meaningfully diminishing the size or devotion of the following, the testimony went on to attract. One significant difference does separate the Blue Avian narrative from its predecessors, and it reflects a broader shift in American cultural attitudes over the intervening decades, rather than anything unique to Good's testimony specifically. Adamski, Van Tassel, and Meyer all described contact occurring largely in the open. Encounters in the desert, telepathic messages received by ordinary civilians with no institutional involvement, extraterrestrial visitors operating independently of any claimed government program. Good's narrative, by contrast, embeds its extraterrestrial contact within an elaborate, decades-spanning framework of secret military and corporate programs, hidden bases, and a compartmentalized shadow government operating beyond any public accountability, with the Blue Avians entering the story only after Good's claimed decades of service within that hidden apparatus. This shift, from open contact with independent space visitors in the 1950s to contact mediated through a vast, concealed government corporate conspiracy by the 2010s, closely tracks the broader trajectory of American public trust in government and institutions across the same period, shaped by the cumulative cultural impact of events including the Watergate scandal, revelations of covert programs such as MKUltra, and, more recently, the Edward Snowden disclosures and a broader post-9/11 culture of surveillance and institutional secrecy. The contactee narrative did not disappear between the 1950s and the 2010s. It adapted, absorbing each era's specific anxieties and specific reasons for distrust, while preserving the same essential emotional core across every version: an ordinary person chosen for contact by a benevolent, more advanced intelligence, tasked with delivering an urgent message of hope, transformation, and moral responsibility to a humanity that has lost its way. That emotional core, and its remarkable persistence across 70 years of otherwise very different cultural, political, and technological contexts, raises a question this documentary has so far only gestured toward. Why does this specific kind of story, a lone messenger, a benevolent non-human teacher, an urgent call to spiritual transformation, keep reappearing, generation after generation, dressed in whatever specific vocabulary and specific anxieties happen to be culturally available at the time? Answering that question requires moving beyond the specific factual claims of any individual contactee, including Corey Goode, and into the underlying psychological and sociological territory that this pattern of belief occupies, the subject of the next part of this documentary. Why these stories endure: a psychological and sociological reading. Having traced the Blue Avian narrative through its mythological borrowings, its channeled and psychic sources, its testimonial claims, its legal disputes, and its place within a 70-year lineage of contactee movements, this documentary now turns to a different kind of question. Not whether the story is true, but why stories built on this same template keep recurring across generations, cultures, and moments of crisis, and why they attract devoted, sincere followings, regardless of how thoroughly individual claims within them are challenged or discredited. Researchers who study belief in conspiracy theories and paranormal claims, including psychologist Karen Douglas, whose work in this area is widely cited within the academic literature, have identified a consistent set of underlying psychological needs that these belief systems tend to satisfy, independent of whether the specific claims involved are accurate. The first category is epistemic, a need for understanding, coherence, and certainty in a world that often presents itself as confusing, contradictory, and difficult to make sense of through ordinary official channels. A narrative like the Blue Avian story offers exactly this kind of coherence. It does not simply describe a single anomalous event, but weaves ancient mythology, historical prophecy, secret government history, and a detailed cosmology of spiritual densities into a single, internally consistent explanatory system that accounts for a remarkably wide range of otherwise disconnected phenomena, from Thunderbird legends to unexplained government spending to a general cultural sense that something important is being withheld from ordinary people. The second category of psychological need Douglas and other researchers identify is existential, a need for security and control, particularly acute during periods of genuine, large-scale uncertainty and threat. It is not a coincidence that Adamski's Venusian visitors arrived with warnings about nuclear annihilation at the height of Cold War anxiety, or that the Blue Avians arrived, in Good's account, promising a benevolent, guided transition through a moment widely understood across a wide range of unrelated cultural movements in the early 2010s, as a period of significant global instability and transformation. A narrative offering benevolent, powerful, non-human guardians quietly working to steer humanity away from catastrophe provides real psychological comfort in the face of threats. Nuclear war, climate change, pandemic disruption, political polarization, economic precarity that can otherwise feel too large, too diffuse, and too far beyond any individual's control to process directly. This is not a criticism of the people who find comfort in such a narrative. It is a well-documented and, in many respects, entirely understandable human response to living through periods of genuine and sustained uncertainty. The third category is social, a need for belonging, self-image, and community, and this may be the most consequential category for understanding how a story like the Blue Avians moves from a single individual's private testimony into a sustained, multi-year cultural phenomenon with conferences, fan art, and its own internal disputes and factions. Belief communities built around contact narratives offer genuine social goods, shared identity, a sense of being part of a select group entrusted with important, hidden knowledge, regular gathering points such as the conference circuit discussed in the previous parts of this documentary, and often deep, long-lasting friendships formed among people who might otherwise never have found one another. The experience of discovering a community that shares one's specific, often socially stigmatized interests and beliefs can be profoundly validating, and it is worth taking seriously as a genuine benefit that these communities provide their members, entirely apart from any question of whether the underlying claims are factually accurate. This social dimension connects to a broader sociological concept worth naming directly, the cultic milieu, a term coined by sociologist Colin Campbell in the early 1970s to describe the loose, overlapping network of heterodox, rejected, or marginalized belief systems that tend to cluster together and cross-pollinate within a shared subculture, even when their specific claims are logically unrelated or even contradictory. UFO contact testimony, ancient astronaut theory, alternative medicine, astrology, channeled spiritual teaching, and government conspiracy research do not share any necessary logical connection to one another, and yet they consistently appear together, promoted by overlapping figures, discussed at the same conferences, and consumed by significantly overlapping audiences. Gaia's own platform, discussed in earlier parts of this documentary, illustrates this pattern directly. Having built its business around exactly this cluster of content, yoga and meditation programming sitting alongside secret space program testimony and alternative health claims, unified not by shared factual grounding, but by a shared audience drawn to heterodox, officially unsanctioned knowledge across multiple domains at once. A more recent term, coined by researchers Charlotte Ward and David Voas in an academic paper published in 2011, captures a particularly relevant version of this same clustering phenomenon, conspirituality, describing the specific fusion of conspiracy theory with New Age spiritual belief, in which political and institutional distrust combines with a spiritual framework of awakening, ascension, and hidden cosmic truth. The Blue Avian narrative sits about as close to the center of this category as any contemporary example available. Its account of secret military programs and hidden government malfeasance is inseparable from its account of spiritual densities, ascension, and cosmic harvest, with the two threads reinforcing one another throughout. Political distrust lending urgency to the spiritual message, and the spiritual framework offering meaning and hope in response to the political distrust. This fusion is not accidental or unique to Good's testimony. It reflects a documented and increasingly studied pattern within contemporary alternative belief culture more broadly, one that researchers have connected to the same overlapping community that, in recent years, has also produced significant overlap with anti-vaccine sentiment, wellness industry conspiracy content, and adjacent political conspiracy movements. It is worth pairing this analysis with a related concept from existential psychology, developed originally by anthropologist Ernest Becker and later formalized by social psychologists as terror management theory, the idea that a significant portion of human culture, belief, and behavior functions at some level as a defense against the anxiety produced by awareness of one's own mortality, and that people are drawn toward belief systems and worldviews that offer some form of symbolic or literal transcendence of that basic existential threat. A narrative describing humanity as standing at the threshold of a guided cosmic transformation, overseen by ancient, benevolent, spiritually advanced beings invested in the outcome, offers exactly this kind of transcendent framework. Individual death and individual insignificance are reframed within a much larger, meaningful, cosmically significant story, one in which the ordinary details of a single human life connect to a vast, ancient, and ultimately hopeful cosmic drama. This does not require any of the specific factual claims within the Blue Avian narrative to be true in order to explain its emotional appeal. It only requires that the narrative successfully offers this kind of meaning-making structure to people seeking it, which, judged purely by its cultural staying power across the past decade, it plainly has. None of this psychological and sociological analysis should be read as dismissive of the people drawn to this story, and it would be a significant misreading of the material to treat "this narrative fulfills a psychological need" as equivalent to "this narrative is therefore false," or "the people who believe it are simply gullible." Psychological needs for coherence, security, and belonging are universal human experiences, not markers of any particular deficiency, and they operate just as powerfully within mainstream religious traditions, conventional political ideologies, and institutional science as they do within fringe contactee movements. The difference lies not in whether these needs are present, but in the specific evidentiary standards each domain applies, and the degree to which a given community's claims are structured, as this documentary has shown repeatedly across the Blue Avian narrative specifically, to resist rather than invite independent verification. That resistance to verification carries a real cost, and it is worth naming directly before this documentary moves to its concluding parts. Communities built around unfalsifiable testimonial claims are also, by that same structural feature, communities unusually vulnerable to exploitation by individuals within them who may not share the same sincerity as the audience they are addressing. A vulnerability made concrete and specific in the previous discussion of the legal, financial, and intellectual property disputes surrounding Corey Good's own testimony. The same psychological and social needs that make a story like the Blue Avians meaningful and comforting to its audience are also, unavoidably, the the same needs that make that audience a viable commercial market, and distinguishing between a community offering genuine meaning and belonging and a commercial enterprise monetizing that same need is often considerably harder from inside the community than it appears from outside it. With this psychological and sociological context established, this documentary turns in its next part to the more immediate and current question its audience is likely most curious about. Where does the Blue Avian story and the community built around it actually stand today in the wake of the legal disputes, the internal criticism, and most significantly, a tragic and widely reported event within the last several months that has reshaped the entire landscape this narrative was built within? Where the story stands today. The legal dispute between Corey Goode and Gaia, first filed in March of 2020, did not resolve quickly or cleanly. Over the following years, the case in federal court in Colorado grew considerably more complicated than a simple two-party dispute, drawing in additional counterclaims from other figures connected to the broader community, including researcher Jay Widener and another participant, Alyssa Christie Montalbano, each bringing their own claims into the proceeding. By May of 2024, the court entered a final judgment in favor of David Wilcock and an associated foundation bearing his name against one of these counter-claimants, while other portions of the case, including disputes over attorney fees, continued to work their way through the court well into 2025. David Wilcock's own role in the litigation grew increasingly consequential and increasingly complicated as the case progressed. In July of 2025, at a hearing concerning Gaia's motion to compel his cooperation with the discovery process, Wilcock appeared without legal counsel, representing himself. During that hearing, according to public reporting on the proceedings, Wilcock disclosed the existence of a confidential settlement agreement he had reached with Gaia years earlier, around 2018 or 2019. An agreement whose existence had previously only been a matter of speculation within the community, and one that raised new questions about the actual nature of his relationship with the company. During the years, he continued to publicly align himself with Goode's account. The disclosure suggested a considerably more complicated private history between Wilcock, Goode, and Gaia than the public narrative of a unified, ongoing testimony had presented, and it added yet another layer of uncertainty to a story already carrying a substantial number of unresolved questions. Against this backdrop of prolonged litigation, Goode continued to work to shape public perception of his own account. In 2025, he produced and starred in a self-financed documentary titled Beyond Disclosure, The Corey Goode Files, presenting his version of events amid the ongoing legal and community disputes. Public reception to the film was mixed and, among longtime followers of the story, often sharply critical. Several published reviews characterized it as a defensive image rehabilitation exercise rather than a work offering new evidence, noting that it relied heavily on Goode's own framing of himself as a persecuted whistleblower without introducing independent documentation, corroborating witnesses beyond his existing circle, or new physical evidence of any kind. Then, in April of 2026, the story that had connected Corey Goode and David Wilcock for more than a decade came to an abrupt and permanent end in circumstances entirely unrelated to any of the claims this documentary has examined. On April 20th, 2026, David Wilcock died at his residence near Nederland, Colorado, following a call placed to Boulder County Emergency Services in which a dispatcher assessed that the caller might be experiencing a mental health crisis. According to the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, deputies arrived at the scene within minutes and found Wilcock outside the residence holding a weapon. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound shortly after their arrival. He was 53 years old. In a statement released through the Sheriff's Office 2 days later, Wilcock's family confirmed that he had taken his own life after what they described as a long struggle with depression and significant unshared financial difficulties. And they stated directly and unambiguously that there was no evidence of foul play, addressing speculation that had already begun to circulate within parts of the online community, suggesting his death was connected to his research or his public disputes. The family's statement expressed hope that his death would draw greater attention to the need for accessible mental health care. Corey Goode addressed Wilcox's death publicly within days, describing himself as shocked and horrified, and stating that in his last conversations with Wilcox, his former collaborator had spoken about experiencing what Goode described as cyberstalking and its effect on his life. Beyond these initial statements, and beyond the continued, unresolved presence of the underlying Gaia litigation, no further significant public developments in the broader Blue Avian narrative had emerged as of the time this documentary was produced. Wilcox's death leaves the entire Blue Avian story and the wider secret space program narrative it grew out of in a genuinely unresolved and unusual position. The two men most responsible for bringing the Blue Avians to public attention, Goode as the source of the original testimony, Wilcox as the researcher, interviewer, and platform who gave that testimony its philosophical framing and its connection to decades of prior esoteric material, will never again appear together to extend, clarify, or defend the account as a unified pair. The confidential settlement Wilcox disclosed shortly before his death remains only partially understood by the public. The underlying federal litigation, spanning more than 5 years and multiple parties, has yet to produce a clear, final public resolution as of this documentary's production, and the central testimonial claims at the heart of the entire narrative. The physical encounters with raw-tier air, the 20 and back program, the cloaked spheres entering the solar system, remain exactly where they have always stood, asserted, widely circulated, deeply meaningful to a devoted following, and, by their own internal structure, resistant to independent verification one way or the other. This documentary treats David Wilcox's death with the seriousness it deserves, as a genuine human tragedy involving real depression and real financial hardship, entirely separate from any judgment this documentary has made or will make about the credibility of the research he spent much of his career promoting. It is a sobering reminder that behind even the most elaborate and contested public narratives are real people carrying real, often invisible burdens, and that the passionate, sometimes combative communities that form around extraordinary claims are still, underneath everything else, made up of human beings. With the practical and legal history of the Blue Avian narrative now brought fully up to date, this documentary turns in its next part to the broader cultural landscape this story belongs to, its place within the still unfolding, considerably more mainstream conversation around government transparency and unidentified aerial phenomena that has developed in the United States over the past several years, and the very different evidentiary standards that separate that more institutional conversation from the testimony examined throughout this series. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide or a mental health crisis, help is available. In the United States, you can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at any time. Disclosure: 2 ways, the Blue Avians and the government UAP conversation. Over the same years that Corey Goode's testimony was developing into cosmic disclosure, spreading through conferences, and eventually landing in federal court, a very different and considerably more institutional conversation about unidentified objects was unfolding in Washington. One that shares a surface-level vocabulary with the Blue Avian story, uses the same word, disclosure, as a central organizing concept and draws from an overlapping pool of interested viewers and listeners, but that operates under an entirely different evidentiary standard, and that has, for the most part, kept a deliberate and notable distance from testimony of Goode's specific kind. That more institutional conversation traces its most significant recent turning point to December 2017, when the New York Times published an investigation revealing the existence of a Pentagon program known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which had studied reports of unidentified aerial phenomena using a modest budget between 2007 and 2012. The same reporting made public a piece of video footage recorded by Navy pilots and known within the community as the Tic Tac video, showing an unidentified object exhibiting flight characteristics that the pilots involved described as inconsistent with any known aircraft. Central to this reporting were named on-the-record figures operating through conventional channels rather than anonymous testimony, Christopher Mellon, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, and Luis Elizondo, who stated he had run the Pentagon program in question and left government service specifically, in his account, to draw greater attention to the subject through legitimate oversight and media channels. This institutional thread continued to develop over the following years through official, verifiable government action rather than testimony alone. The Department of Defense formally released additional Navy video footage in 2020. A Pentagon task force dedicated to studying unidentified aerial phenomena was established, and in 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released an unclassified preliminary report to Congress assessing a catalog of documented military encounters with unexplained objects. A report that reached no conclusion about extraterrestrial origin, but explicitly declined to rule any explanation out given the limitations of available data. In 2022, this effort was reorganized and expanded into the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, a standing Pentagon office tasked with investigating reports across all military branches on an ongoing basis. The most significant single event in this institutional thread, and the one that draws the closest surface comparison to Corey Goode's testimony, occurred in July of 2023, when David Grush, a former intelligence officer, testified under oath before the House Oversight Committee, stating that he possessed knowledge of a decades-long government program involved in the retrieval and attempted reverse engineering of non-human craft, along with what he described as recovered biological material. Grush's testimony generated enormous public and media attention, and it is easy, from a distance, to see why casual observers might group it together with the secret space program testimony examined throughout this documentary. Both describe hidden government programs, concealed non-human contact, and decades of official secrecy. The distinction that matters, and that this documentary owes its audience directly, concerns the specific evidentiary and institutional framework each kind of testimony operates within, not simply the content of the claims themselves. Grush's testimony was delivered under oath before an elected congressional committee, in a setting where knowingly false statements carry the legal exposure of perjury, following a formal complaint process through the intelligence community's Inspector General, a channel specifically designed to allow classified whistleblower concerns to be raised through legally protected, independently reviewable means. This does not, on its own, prove Grush's underlying claims are accurate. His testimony, like Goode's, remains substantially uncorroborated by independent physical evidence made public as of this documentary's production, and it has drawn its own serious skepticism from other officials and researchers within the same institutional space. What it does provide is a specific, checkable, legally consequential structure around the claim, subject to formal government processes of review, congressional oversight, and legal accountability that Goode's forum posts, television interviews, and conference appearances have never been subject to in the same way, with the singular, telling exception of the sworn deposition testimony discussed earlier in this documentary, given not in service of a whistleblower disclosure, but in the context of a private intellectual property dispute. It is also worth noting directly that figures within the more institutional UAP research and advocacy space have on numerous occasions gone out of their way to publicly distance themselves from testimony of the Goode and Wilcock variety, expressing concern that the far more elaborate, spiritually inflected, and evidentially unconstrained claims associated with the secret space program and Blue Avian narrative risk discrediting by association the more cautious, document and testimony-based case for taking unidentified aerial phenomena seriously as a legitimate subject of institutional inquiry. This tension reflects a real and consequential divide within the broader UFO research community between researchers focused on building an evidentiary case sturdy enough to withstand institutional and scientific scrutiny, and a considerably larger, more heterogeneous online community drawn to the more expansive, spiritually rich, and narratively satisfying testimony that figures like Goode have offered. Testimony that, as this documentary has shown across its examination of the mythology, the psychic sources, the credibility disputes, and the legal record, offers a great deal more narrative coherence than it offers independent verification. The Blue Avians themselves occupy a distinctive place within a still broader pop culture landscape that predates and surrounds both the institutional UAP conversation and Good's specific testimony, the decades-long popularization of ancient astronaut theory as mainstream television entertainment. The History Channel series Ancient Aliens, which began airing in 2010 and has continued for well over a decade, drew directly on the ancient astronaut theory tradition established by Erich von Däniken's 1968 book Chariots of the Gods, itself building on even earlier 20th century speculation connecting ancient mythology, archaeology, and possible extraterrestrial contact. The series featured, across its long run, a rotating cast of researchers and authors making the case, episode after episode, for extraterrestrial involvement in ancient human history, and David Wilcock himself appeared as a recurring guest contributor on the program, placing him, and by extension, the Blue Avian narrative he helped popularize within direct, documented, mainstream television proximity to the exact mythological framework this documentary examined in its early parts. The Thunderbirds, the falcon-headed gods, the winged Apkallu of Mesopotamia, all treated by that program as suggestive evidence for the same broader thesis Good's testimony would later claim to confirm directly. This convergence, a mainstream cable television franchise treating ancient mythology as potential evidence of extraterrestrial contact, an institutional government conversation cautiously investigating unidentified aerial phenomena through formal, legally accountable channels, and a considerably more elaborate, spiritually saturated testimonial tradition culminating in the Blue Avians, describes together the full landscape this documentary has traced across its previous 14 parts. Each of these threads draws on a similar underlying human fascination: the possibility that we are not alone, that our history has been shaped by forces greater than official records acknowledge, and that some form of contact, past or present, connects human civilization to something larger than itself. Each thread also demands a different standard of evidence before that fascination should translate into belief, and conflating those standards, treating a compelling story, however emotionally satisfying, as equivalent to a legally sworn statement, and treating a legally sworn but still uncorroborated statement as equivalent to independently verified physical evidence, is ultimately the central interpretive challenge this entire subject presents to anyone trying to think about it clearly. With every thread of this story now laid out in full, the ancient mythology, the reinterpreted prophecy, the psychic and channeled sources, the testimony itself, the credibility disputes, the courtroom record, the psychological and sociological forces that sustain it, and its place alongside both a wilder television tradition and a more sober institutional inquiry. This documentary turns, in its final part, to what all of this taken together actually tells us, not necessarily about whether the Blue Avians are real, but about the much older and more universal human story this modern claim has quietly stepped into. Conclusion: what the Blue Avians actually tell us. Over the course of this documentary, the Blue Avians have been traced back through nearly every layer of evidence available for examining them. The deep, genuinely ancient mythological record of winged, bird-headed beings spanning North America, South Asia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Mesoamerica, a specific and contested reinterpretation of Hopi prophecy that outside researchers extended well beyond what Hopi spokespeople themselves have said in their own words. The psychic readings of Edgar Cayce, which introduced the phrase "Law of One" decades before anyone spoke of extraterrestrial contact in these terms. The channeled raw material of the early 1980s, which built out the entire philosophical architecture of densities, harvest, and service to self versus service to others that the Blue Avians would later be said to teach almost word for word. The detailed, unverifiable personal testimony of a single man, Corey Goode, whose account forms the entire evidentiary foundation of the modern claim, a body of internal community criticism and a federal lawsuit that placed sworn deposition testimony directly at odds with the story's own public framing, a 70-year lineage of prior contactee testimony that the Blue Avian narrative follows with striking structural fidelity, the psychological and sociological forces that explain why stories of this shape recur across generations regardless of their specific factual status. And finally, a more institutional and considerably more cautious government conversation about unidentified phenomena that has deliberately kept its distance from testimony of this kind. Laid out this way, end to end, a pattern becomes difficult to avoid. Almost nothing about the Blue Avians, examined individually, survives close scrutiny as independent, verifiable evidence of a genuinely ancient extraterrestrial race. The mythology is real but explainable through several competing frameworks that do not require literal alien contact. The prophecy is real but does not, in its own documented form, say what has been claimed on its behalf. The psychic and channeled sources predate the modern testimony by decades and supply its vocabulary rather than confirming its content. The testimony itself is structured by its own internal logic in ways that make external verification effectively impossible, and the specific individuals most responsible for building and popularizing the story have, at various points, faced direct and serious challenges to their credibility from within their own community, and have, in the case of Corey Goode, stated under oath in a court of law that the material constitutes his own intellectual property. And yet dismissing the entire phenomenon as simply false, or the people drawn to it as simply mistaken, would miss something this documentary has tried to take seriously throughout. The fact that a story built this way, from these specific pieces, succeeded so thoroughly for so long with so many people, is itself a fact worth understanding on its own terms. Human beings have been telling this same essential story for thousands of years, in whatever language and imagery their own moment made available to them. A great winged being, more advanced and more benevolent than we are, watching from somewhere beyond ordinary sight, carrying warning and hope in equal measure, arriving precisely when we need it most. Horus watched over the Egyptian dynasties. The Thunderbird watched over the plains and the coasts of North America. Garuda carried Vishnu across the Hindu cosmos. Ashtar's fleet, in the imagination of a California desert gathering in 1952, stood ready to prevent nuclear annihilation. And in 2014, in a story assembled from all of this inherited material and delivered through a television studio rather than a temple or a desert campfire, the Blue Avians arrived to tell a new generation, worried about entirely new things, that they were not alone, that something larger and kinder was paying attention, and that the choice to build a better future remained, in the end, humanity's own to make. That final piece of the message, tag you're it, the responsibility was always yours, may be the most genuinely interesting thing to survive this entire investigation, regardless of where the Blue Avians themselves came from. Strip away the spacecraft, the secret programs, the trademarks, and the lawsuits, and what remains is a message that requires no 7-foot feathered visitor to be true. That meaning is something people build together, that fear responds to courage rather than rescue, and that the future is not something that arrives from outside, but something made deliberately by the people living through it. Whether the Blue Avians are real remains, as it has been from the first page of this documentary, a question this account cannot answer on the audience's behalf. What can be said, with confidence, is that the story of the Blue Avians is real. Real as a cultural phenomenon, real as a decade of testimony, real as a federal court case, real as a devoted community, and real as the latest chapter in something human beings have been doing for longer than any written record can trace. Looking up in moments of uncertainty and hoping that something is looking back. Every documentary has to end somewhere, and the previous part closed this one the way most accounts of the Blue Avians eventually have to close. Not with resolution, but with an honest acknowledgement that the story remains unfinished, contested, and, in its most important particulars, unverifiable. That is a legitimate place to stop. It is not, however, the whole picture, and a few threads deserve to be picked back up before this account is truly complete. What became of the wider cast of people who built and populated this narrative alongside Corey Goode? What a viewer should actually do the next time a story shaped like this one arrives? And what, if anything, survives the collapse of any individual claim within it? Start with the people. Corey Goode and David Wilcock were never the only two figures carrying this story forward, and the community around them did not stop moving simply because this documentary reached a conclusion. Emery Smith, who appeared alongside Goode across dozens of episodes of Cosmic Disclosure, describing his own claimed 20-year off-world service, including alleged work retrieving crashed craft and treating recovered biological specimens, has continued producing testimony and public appearances well past the period this documentary has examined in detail, expanding his account over the years to include descriptions of interdimensional portal technology and further detail on what he characterizes as deliberate government disinformation efforts aimed at the broader disclosure community. Jason Rice, introduced earlier in this documentary as Goode's successor on Gaia, and as the testifier whose strikingly similar account became a flashpoint in the Goode-Gaia litigation, has likewise remained an active figure, continuing to describe his own claimed service, including specific accounts of conflict with a breakaway Mars colony and further installments of his own 20 and Back narrative, delivered across further seasons of programming produced independently of Goode. In 2025, Rice's testimony reached a new stage when he underwent a polygraph examination, the results of which were promoted within the disclosure community and its associated media as validation of his claims. It is worth pausing on this specific detail because it offers a useful, self-contained lesson in evidentiary reasoning that applies well beyond this one case. Polygraph testing does not measure truth or falsehood directly. It measures physiological arousal, heart rate, skin conductance, respiration, under the assumption that deception reliably produces a distinct and detectable stress response, an assumption that has been extensively studied and found by the overwhelming consensus of the relevant scientific literature, including reviews conducted by bodies such as the National Academy of Sciences, to be unreliable enough that polygraph results are inadmissible as evidence of truth in the great majority of courts in the United States and are treated by professional intelligence and law enforcement agencies as, at best, an investigative aid rather than a determination of fact. A polygraph result can indicate that a person did not exhibit the physiological markers associated with conscious, deliberate deception while making a specific statement. It cannot indicate that the statement is objectively true, and it is entirely possible to pass a polygraph while describing a sincerely held but factually mistaken belief, a rehearsed and internalized narrative, or a claim shaped by any of the psychological processes discussed earlier in this documentary. Citing a past polygraph as confirmation of an extraordinary claim is, in practice, a rhetorical move rather than a scientific one, and its continued use across this community is itself a small but telling data point about how evidence gets constructed and consumed within it. Bill Ryan, whose 2017 critique remains one of the most substantive internal challenges this narrative has ever faced, has continued his broader work as an independent researcher and writer in the years since, maintaining his stated position on Goode's credibility without significant public reversal. Jay Widener, who appeared throughout this documentary both as a Cosmic Disclosure interviewer working alongside Jason Rice and as a named counterclaimant in the Goode vs. Gaia litigation, remains an active participant in the broader alternative history and disclosure media landscape. Kerry Cassidy has continued to run Project Camelot independently, maintaining a position more sympathetic to whistleblower testimony broadly than Ryan's, while still having raised, in her own writing, the pointed and unresolved question of whether Goode's account was truly original. None of these figures has, as of this documentary's production, offered anything resembling independent physical corroboration for the central claims examined throughout this account. The community, in other words, has continued to grow, fracture, and regenerate itself, producing new testifiers, new claimed encounters, and new internal disputes using essentially the same evidentiary structure, personal testimony, internally consistent terminology, and claims arranged in ways that resist external verification, that has characterized this entire narrative since Goode's own testimony first appeared in 2014. This raises the genuinely useful question this epilogue exists to address. Given that stories shaped like this one are not going to stop appearing, given the 70-year lineage traced earlier in this documentary from Adamski through Van Tassel and Meyer to Good, Smith, and Rice, and given the psychological and sociological forces that make this kind of narrative reliably compelling, regardless of its factual accuracy, what should a thoughtful person actually do the next time a new account of this general kind surfaces, whether it concerns Blue Avians, a new species entirely, or some future variation this documentary cannot anticipate? A useful starting principle, associated most closely with the astronomer and science communicator Carl Sagan, though built on a much older philosophical foundation, holds that claims of unusual magnitude require a correspondingly unusual weight of supporting evidence before they merit belief. Not because extraordinary claims are inherently less likely to be true than ordinary ones in some mystical sense, but because accepting them requires overturning a much larger body of existing, well-supported understanding, and that larger body of understanding deserves proportionally more evidence to displace it. A claim that a stranger drove to your city yesterday requires very little evidence to accept because it fits comfortably within everything already known about how cars and cities work. A claim that a 7-foot, telepathic, avian extraterrestrial arrived aboard a cloaked moon-sized sphere to deliver a private spiritual teaching to one individual asks a great deal more of the surrounding body of established knowledge, and it is entirely reasonable, not closed-minded, to require a correspondingly greater quantity and quality of independent evidence before accepting it as established fact rather than as an interesting, unresolved claim. A second, closely related principle comes from the philosopher of science Karl Popper, whose work on the demarcation between science and non-science centered on the concept of falsifiability, the idea that a genuinely scientific claim must, at least in principle, specify what kind of evidence would prove it false and must remain open to that possibility. This documentary has returned repeatedly to a specific structural feature running through nearly every layer of the Blue Avian narrative. The 20 and Back program explains, by design, why no gap appears in Good's public record. The non-interference principle explains, by design, why no direct, undeniable confirmation of the sphere-being alliance has ever occurred. The telepathic nature of the contact explains, by design, why no verbatim, independently checkable transcript of what raw tier air actually communicated could ever exist. Each of these features may have a sincere and internally coherent explanation within the story's own logic. Each of them also happens to remove, in advance, precisely the kind of evidence that would otherwise allow an outside observer to test the claim. A useful, practical habit for evaluating any future claim of this kind is to ask a simple question. What, specifically, would this person or this community accept as evidence that the claim is false? And is that evidence something that could, even in principle, ever actually arrive? If the answer is no, if the story's own internal logic guarantees that no disconfirming evidence could ever surface, that is not proof the claim is false, but it is a meaningful signal that the claim has been constructed, whether deliberately or not, outside the reach of ordinary evaluation, and it warrants being held with a correspondingly lighter grip. None of this is offered as a tool for mockery, and it would be a mistake for anyone using this documentary as a reference to walk away treating skepticism as a license for contempt toward the people drawn to stories like this one. The line separating a healthy, engaged interest in a rich, emotionally resonant mythology from an uncritical acceptance of its literal factual claims is a real and useful line, and it is entirely possible to stand on the right side of it while still finding genuine value in the story. A person can appreciate the Blue Avian narrative as a striking piece of contemporary folklore, worthy of the same kind of careful, respectful attention this documentary has given to the Thunderbird, to Horus, and to Garuda, without needing to accept that a real, physical, telepathic, bird-headed alien delivered a private teaching to a single Texas-born man in 2014. A person can find the message that responsibility for the future rests with human beings rather than external saviors, that fear responds to inner courage rather than rescue, that community and meaning matter, genuinely useful and worth carrying forward, independent of any judgment about spacecraft or secret programs. Myths have always done exactly this kind of work for human beings, carrying real moral and psychological value forward across generations, regardless of whether the specific gods, spirits, or messengers within them were ever, in a literal sense, physically present. That distinction matters more now than it did when Adamski first described Orthon in 1952 for a specific and identifiable reason. The imagery itself has begun to travel further and faster than the story's own contested history can keep up with. In the years since Cosmic Disclosure first aired, the striking 7-foot blue-feathered image of the Blue Avian has taken on a life increasingly independent of the specific claims, legal disputes, and credibility questions. This documentary has spent 16 parts examining short-form video platforms built around rapid visual consumption rather than extended narrative context, have carried illustrations and animations of the Blue Avians to audiences considerably younger and considerably less familiar with Corey Goode, Gaia, or the raw material than the original Cosmic Disclosure viewership ever was. Audiences encountering the image first, often stripped of any accompanying explanation of where it came from or what has been said, both for and against its underlying claims. Tattoos depicting the being have appeared among believers who describe a personal, spiritual connection to the image independent of Goode's specific biography. Small handmade shrines and altars incorporating Blue Avian artwork have been documented within some corners of the broader New Age and Starseed community, treating the figure less as a documented historical claim and more as a devotional object, comparable in function, whatever one makes of the comparison, to the way earlier generations related to Horus or to Garuda, a symbol carrying meaning and comfort that operates, for the person holding it, largely independent of any external verification process at all. This is, in its own way, the clearest possible demonstration of everything this documentary has argued from its opening minutes onward. The image of a great winged being, blue and vast and watching from somewhere beyond ordinary sight, does not need Corey Goode's testimony to survive, and it will very likely outlast every specific claim examined across this account. The lawsuits, the depositions, the trademark filings, the internal community disputes, even the specific name Blue Avian itself, in exactly the same way the image outlasted the specific pharaohs who once worshipped Horus, the specific Hopi elders who first carried word of the blue star, and the specific Assyrian kings who once stood beside carved eagle-headed Apkallu in their palace halls. The figure changes shape to fit whatever century produces it. The underlying human need it answers does not change nearly as much. That is where this account leaves the subject, and it is, in the end, the most honest place available to leave it. Nothing in the historical, legal, testimonial, or psychological record examined throughout this documentary provides independent, verifiable confirmation that a race of Blue Avian telepathic extraterrestrials has made ongoing contact with a secret space program insider in the years since 2014. The specific evidentiary chain offered in support of that claim, ancient mythology, reinterpreted prophecy, borrowed philosophical vocabulary, personal testimony structured to resist verification, and a legal record that has, at points, directly undercut the story's own public framing, does not, examined piece by piece, hold together as a case that would satisfy an ordinary standard of evidence in any other domain of serious inquiry, and yet the story persists, not because the evidence compels belief, but because it answers something older and more durable than any single claim within it, the same watchful, winged figure human beings have been imagining above them for as long as there has been sky to look up at, and reason enough, in every age, to hope that something is looking back. This documentary does not ask its audience to believe in the Blue Avians. It asks only that whatever conclusion each viewer reaches, they reach it having seen the whole picture, the myth, the prophecy, the psychic record, the testimony, the courtroom, the community, and the 70-year pattern this single striking story quietly stepped into. What is done with that picture from here belongs to the audience alone. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.